Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. We're diving straight into the shadowy corners of stone hallways, winding staircases, and behind the thick wooden doors of history's most misunderstood monuments, medieval castles. And no, we're not here for knights and tournaments. We're here to talk about what sex was really like inside those echoey chambers of power, privilege, and stone-cold discomfort. Spoiler alert, it's probably not what you've seen on TV. There's less velvet and candles and a lot more fleas, political strategy and, let's be honest, some real weirdness. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. You know the drill. And let me know in the comments, what city are you in right now and what time is it for you? I love knowing where you all are listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start at the beginning, or at least with the setting. Imagine yourself standing just inside the main keep of a 13th century castle. It's grand, in a cold and slightly grimy way. The floors are stone, mostly covered in rushes or straw that have seen better days. The walls are thick, damp, and dimly lit by torchlight or a narrow sliver of daylight from arrow-slit windows. Your breath fogs the air slightly, even indoors, because yes, castles were cold. Really cold. In winter, the only warmth came from fireplaces, huge stone hearths that never fully beat back the chill. And in summer, you traded your frostbite for flies. You head toward the solar, the private upper floor chamber where the lord and lady of the castle sometimes retreated for more quiet, personal matters. Private being a generous word. Bedrooms were rarely just for two. Servants, guards, even a scribe or page might be sleeping on pallets nearby. People didn't have the same concept of privacy we do today. You didn't exactly shut the door for romance. You maybe pulled a curtain across a bed alcove if you were rich, or just tried not to make too much noise. Except sometimes, weirdly, making noise was the point. For nobles, sex wasn't just personal, it was political. When a royal couple married, the consummation of that marriage had witnesses. Actual real people stood nearby, or even in the room, to observe and confirm that yes, this legal and dynastic bond had been physically sealed. You'd crawl into the bed while guests waited outside, or stayed inside drinking, and you might emerge hours later with a dishevelled head of hair and the weight of generations on your back. But back to the room. Picture the classic medieval great bed. These were enormous four-posted affairs with heavy curtains. Not because they were into drama, okay, maybe a little, but mostly to hold in warmth. Linen sheets if you were lucky, fur blankets if you were really lucky, a fire maybe, but don't count on it. If you were anything less than royalty, chances are you were doing it on a straw mattress that smelled like damp wool and goat, which, incidentally, might have been standing 3 feet away watching you. Castles were working homes, not romantic getaways. And let's talk about the mood. Was there candlelight? Probably. Incense? Rarely. A lute player? Only in the movies. More likely, the distant sound of clanking armour, a guard clearing his throat, someone puking into a chamber pot down the hall. Sexy. You might imagine medieval people were just constantly repressed, or maybe on the other end of the spectrum, wild and uninhibited because they didn't have modern rules. The truth is messier. Sex in castles wasn't necessarily more or less frequent than today. It was just entangled with survival, status, and sometimes the weather. People slept in shifts, often fully clothed, and if someone did manage to get naked, it was a production. Think layers of linen, wool, lacing, and grime. Bathing wasn't daily. It wasn't even weekly for many. And yet, people made it work. You kind of had to. Producing an heir wasn't optional. It was your job. One weird historical fact. Medieval people often believed in conception by mutual orgasm. Yep. According to popular medieval medicine, a child couldn't be conceived unless both partners enjoyed themselves. This gave women, especially noble women, a strange specific kind of power. They could claim a child wasn't theirs because they hadn't climaxed. It wasn't accurate science, obviously, but it shows that sex wasn't treated as purely one-sided or mechanical. In theory. But let's not romanticize it too much. If you were a noblewoman, you didn't necessarily choose your partner. Your father, or sometimes your king, did. Your marriage was a contract, a treaty, a land deal with a kiss, maybe. Love was not guaranteed. At best, it was hoped for. at worst, irrelevant. In many noble households, sex was duty, not desire. And yet, despite all of this, people still found ways to be human about it. Letters, poems, gifts, little signs that behind the cold stone and arranged unions there were still hearts beating. Now, scholars don't all agree on how often people actually had sex in medieval castles. Records are sketchy, and let's face it, nobody was keeping a bedroom log for future historians. Some argue that the Church's obsession with purity and sin meant people were more restrained. Others say the rules only pushed everything underground. The truth, as usual, is probably both. Publicly, piety; privately, whatever you could get away with. So here you are, standing in this drafty upper room, firelight flickering on worn tapestries, with a bed that smells faintly of smoked meat and yesterday's shoes. Maybe you're a noble, maybe you're a servant. Either way, your love life is shaped by forces bigger than you: the church, your family, your social rank, even the kind of castle you live in. And the reality check? You probably won't survive this era long enough to enjoy a golden anniversary. Between disease, childbirth, war, and famine, the medieval world doesn't offer much longevity. But in the time you do have, intimacy isn't frivolous, it's survival, it's legacy. And sometimes, even in the shadows of political marriages and public performances, it's love. Alright, so you're mentally curled up in that drafty solar, surrounded by centuries of old stone and half-heard whispers through thick walls. Now it's time to ask the obvious question: how did people in medieval castles actually get to sex? I mean physically, practically, because the logistics, they were a full-on nightmare. Let's start with clothing. You are at all times layered like a historical onion with zero interest in your personal convenience. If you're a nobleman, you're rocking a linen undershirt, a padded tunic, sometimes another longer tunic over that, hose tied with points to a belt, and depending on the century, maybe a surcoat or robe. If you're armoured up, forget it. You're a walking chastity cage. And for women, oh boy, a chemise, a kirtle, possibly a corset, though not the Victorian kind, a gown, maybe a girdle belt, and don't forget the headwear. Removing all of this isn't just foreplay, it's a test of your endurance. Nothing says sexy like unlacing 12 separate garments in the dark while a brazier slowly dies in the corner. Then there's hygiene. You've probably heard the old myth that medieval people never bathed. That's not exactly true. They did bathe, sometimes. If you were rich, you might have a wooden tub brought to your chamber and filled with warm water by servants who carried it up in buckets. Soap existed, usually made of animal fat and ashes. Still, nobody smelled like lavender and sea salt. Scented oils and herbs were used to mask funk, but natural musk was the vibe. And oral hygiene? If you had a full set of teeth, congratulations, you were practically a unicorn. So now that you're partially naked and moderately smelly, let's talk about when people had sex, not just at night. Daylight hours were totally fair game, especially since artificial lighting was expensive and firewood had to be rationed. And since you shared your bedroom with staff or family members, or even the occasional visiting noble, opportunities had to be seized, quietly, discreetly, or sometimes not at all. Let's zoom in on one little-known but deeply unsexy detail: the medieval concept of the nightshirt. This was a loose garment you wore specifically to sleep, or to do things in, without being completely nude. Yes, many people had sex with at least one layer still on. And no, that wasn't necessarily about modesty. It was cold. Your mattress was probably straw stuffed into a sack. The walls leaked. Privacy was almost non-existent. Being naked wasn't just vulnerable, it was uncomfortable. So, clothing stayed on, or halfway on, or bunched awkwardly around your knees while you tried not to disturb the dog curled up at your feet. Speaking of feet, let's not skip over medieval foot hygiene. Ever try to feel sexy while someone's calloused toes scrape against your leg like pumice stones dipped in sheep grease? Yeah, romance. Now let's introduce a fun historical fact. Some wealthier nobles used bed warmers. Not the people kind, actual devices. Picture a metal pan filled with hot coals, slid between the sheets before bedtime to take the edge off the frost. Romantic in theory. In practice, they often scorched the sheets or sparked tiny fires. Nothing says, let's get intimate, like evacuating your burning bedchamber. But hey, maybe you're determined. You've fought off a dozen laces and 2 wool tunics. The fire is lit. The dog's been bribed with a bone. So who's making the first move? In the noble classes, sex wasn't always a mutual decision. If you were married, it was expected, especially if you hadn't produced an heir. For men, initiating wasn't questioned. For women, it could be complicated. Culturally, female desire was seen as suspicious or even dangerous. A passionate wife might be interpreted as sinful, or worse, manipulative. The double standard was alive and very well fed. But even in this chilly, rule-bound, overlayered world, people found ways to be affectionate. We have scattered bits of evidence, love letters preserved in monasteries, poetry smuggled between castle walls, gifts exchanged in secret, a silk ribbon, a carved charm, a flower dried between the pages of a religious text. Courtly love might have been a stylized game, but sometimes it was also real. Here's a quirky fact for you. Some castle residents believed in the power of aphrodisiac foods. Oysters weren't an option, but spiced wine, figs and almonds were believed to stoke the fires of passion. Certain herbs, like fennel and lovage, were added to meals not just for flavour, but for what we'd now call their bedroom potential. Whether they worked is up for debate, but the placebo effect is timeless. Now for a scholarly hot topic. How often did medieval nobles actually have sex? Some historians argue it was infrequent, maybe once or twice a week, due to religious restrictions, exhaustion, and general inconvenience. Others argue that the pressure to produce heirs and secure dynasties made it more routine, even mechanical. Then throw in religious no-go days, Fridays, Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, the list goes on, and the calendar starts to look pretty bleak, unless you were a rule breaker. And let's be honest, quite a few people were. Let's wrap this up with one last visual. You're lying on a lumpy mattress in your finest linen nightwear, listening to the wind whistle through the arrow slits. You've successfully undressed just enough to not freeze to death. You've eaten your fig and washed it down with lukewarm spiced wine. Your partner smells vaguely of horse sweat and rosemary. Somewhere in the background, a servant coughs and shifts on their pallet. There's a dog at your feet and a tapestry flapping against the wall. It's not glamorous, it's not steamy, but it's human. And that's what this journey's about. Not just the sex, but the messy, layered, oddly beautiful way people found intimacy in a world that didn't make it easy. Because somehow, despite the constraints and the cold, they still tried. So you've just had your modest moment of medieval intimacy, probably while fully or half dressed, under a mound of scratchy blankets, and with at least one unblinking servant pretending to sleep 6 feet away. Let's talk about that next. Because if there's one thing that really sets medieval castle life apart from our modern understanding of privacy, it's this. There wasn't any. Seriously. The idea of closing a door and being alone, just the two of you, was basically science fiction. You're not living in a cosy one-bedroom flat. You're in a massive stone structure designed for defence, not comfort, and definitely not for subtle romantic rendezvous. Rooms are large, echoey, and often multi-purpose. That bed chamber you've got. It's not necessarily just a place to sleep. It might also be where you meet with advisors, review scrolls, pray, or have breakfast with visiting dignitaries. It could even be where you hold court. There's a decent chance your personal chaplain or a steward is within earshot most hours of the day. Now let's say you're a lady of the castle. You might technically have a boudoir, but you're rarely alone in it. There's always someone flitting around, maids brushing out your hair, an older chaperone assigned to keep your honour intact, younger ladies in waiting giggling in the corners, and occasionally a dog who's very interested in what you're doing under the covers. And even if you're a high-ranking man, you don't escape the watchful eyes. Pages, squires, or even a personal valet are likely posted in your chamber, just out of view but close enough to respond to your every whim, including, say, when your stockings go missing or your candle goes out. This wasn't just a matter of practicality, it was cultural. The concept of the individual, the modern idea that people are entitled to a private life, just didn't exist in the same way. Your body, your time, even your bed were seen as part of the larger household structure, especially if you were important. The more powerful you were, the more people watched you, literally and figuratively. And then there were the servants. Let's just talk frankly here. They saw everything. They dressed you, bathed you, sometimes helped you undress before bed and knew exactly what happened after the curtains closed, or didn't. For some, this was awkward. For others, it was just part of the job. In fact, servants were often a primary source of gossip in castles. Want to know who's sleeping with whom? Don't look to the heralds or knights, listen to the scullery maid, she knows everything. One fascinating historical nugget. Some noble households actually kept records of who visited whom during the night. This wasn't just for scandal, it had legal and political implications. If you were trying to prove infidelity or protect a marriage alliance, the comings and goings of guests became vital evidence. People might have literally written down, Lady so-and-so was seen leaving Lord such-and-such's chamber at the third bell. Imagine living your life under that kind of watch. Now for a quirky fact, some noble families intentionally arranged their children's beds in the same room to keep tabs on behaviour. Basically, imagine being a teenager trying to get frisky with a crush, while your siblings are 2 feet away pretending to sleep. Welcome to the medieval version of birth control. It wasn't subtle, but it was effective. But here's the twist. While the lack of privacy was stifling in many ways, it also created this strange atmosphere of quiet tolerance. People knew things were happening behind those tapestries. People heard things, and while the church and public law might rail against lust in private, nobles, servants, and everyone in between tended to turn a blind eye. As long as no one got pregnant, no alliances were endangered, and no one broke rank with the wrong partner. Affairs happened, encounters occurred, gossip flowed like wine, but rarely did anything truly scandalous see the light of the legal system, unless someone wanted it to. And this leads us to one of the more debated questions among historians. Just how acceptable was extramarital sex, really? Some argue that it was rampant, almost expected among the upper classes, especially for men. Others suggest it was dangerous, with real consequences if discovered. The truth? It varied. In one castle, an affair could be quietly ignored. In another, it might spark a blood feud. The line between discretion and disgrace was thin and often political. But while nobles played their games of strategy and seduction, castle servants lived by an entirely different rhythm. For them, privacy was even more rare, and oddly more accessible. With everyone so preoccupied with noble affairs, servants often slipped under the radar. A quick kiss in the kitchen, a midnight meeting in the stable. It was risky, but it happened. And sometimes those relationships were more about genuine connection than the cold calculations happening upstairs. One surviving letter from a young servant to her soldier lover reads like something out of a soap opera, full of longing, jealousy, and bold declarations. We don't know how it ended, but we know this. She wrote it in Latin, possibly to keep it secret. Even passion needed code. So here you are, back in that chamber, curtains drawn, the fires burned low, a page is asleep near the hearth, snoring faintly. Your lover's breath is warm against your neck. But even now, you know that this isn't entirely yours. This moment might be whispered about tomorrow. That muffled laughter you hear outside your door, that could be servants or spies. Even when you're alone, you're not alone. Not in a castle, not in this world. And as much as people longed for connection, they also had to guard it. Like a secret ember in a cold room full of watching eyes. Sex wasn't just about bodies, it was about territory, reputation, silence. And still, somehow, despite all the tension and surveillance, people reach for each other. They found ways to be intimate in a society that left very little space for it. Because that's what humans do, isn't it? They adapt, they sneak, they risk. Even in castles with 10-foot walls, freezing halls and whispering corners, desire still found its way in. You wake up on a lumpy mattress, tangled in linen and fur, the dying fire casting orange shadows against cold stone. There's no alarm clock. The castle stirs when it wants. Groaning beams, clinking armour, and servants already sweeping rushes in the hall below. Your body's sore, probably from sleeping in the same position all night to avoid drafts or stray elbows. Next to you, your partner is still asleep, or pretending to be. You both know that once you step out of bed, the world resets. Titles, duty, hierarchy. But for now, there's a few more minutes of quiet. And now the real machinery kicks in. Because if you think sex in a medieval castle was just about attraction or passion or, heaven forbid, romantic spontaneity, think again. It was paperwork. It was alliances. It was politics wrapped in lace. Let's talk about marriage, because that's where most of this starts, or ends, depending on how lucky or unlucky you were. Marriage in the medieval aristocracy wasn't built on love. It wasn't even built on compatibility. It was a chess game, and you were the pawn, or maybe the queen, if you were strategic enough. Your union was arranged years in advance, often while you were still a child. A promise between your father and someone else's father, usually scribbled on a scroll and sealed with wax with a castle, a field, or a small army as the dowry. You might not meet your spouse until your wedding day, and even then the event wasn't really about you. It was about securing borders, passing on land, or making sure someone's cousin didn't declare war over a misplaced vineyard. Now here's a historical tidbit that never gets enough attention. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included very detailed sexual clauses. Yep, not exactly sweet nothings. More like, the groom shall not be absent more than 40 nights, and must provide proof of attempt to conceive. Romance. The kind of romance where your family lawyer stands 2 feet away while you discuss intercourse logistics. And this leads us to the medieval honeymoon, or what passed for one. You're not heading to the coast, you're heading to the bedding ceremony. Sounds fun, right? Spoiler, it's awkward. After the wedding feast, the couple is escorted, sometimes carried, sometimes paraded into the bedchamber, where the guests help undress them, offer toasts and occasionally hang around just long enough to ensure the new marriage is consummated. Think of it like a full-court press of nosy aunties and drunk uncles yelling, "Go on then," from the sidelines. This wasn't optional. Inheritance, legitimacy and honour all hinged on that first night. People needed proof, sometimes literal proof, bedsheets stained and displayed. Again, romantic. And what if you couldn't perform? Well, let's just say that a marriage could be annulled on the grounds of impotence. You could be examined in public. There were even medical trials where a groom had to demonstrate his ability before a council. Talk about performance anxiety. But even once the bedding was done and dusted, sex didn't just stop being political. In fact, it only began to matter more. Producing an heir, preferably a son, wasn't just desirable, it was your job. If your first child was a girl, you were politely congratulated and quietly pressured to get back to work. A second girl? Awkward silence. A third? People start looking sideways at you, or worse, your spouse. Infertility was always suspicious, and in the sexist logic of the day, usually blamed on the woman. Never mind that your husband might be 55 and riddled with battlefield injuries. Clearly it was your fault for being too cold or too sinful, or not praying hard enough to St. Margaret. Quirky fact of the day, some couples try to fix fertility problems by visiting relics, holy body parts or miracle shrines. One popular site claimed a relic of St. Anne's breast could grant conception. Others drank fertility potions made from crushed herbs, goat's milk, or even powdered gems. None of this worked, of course, but people were desperate. The line between medical advice and magical thinking was blurry at best. And here's a scholarly debate that still rages. Did medieval noblewomen have any say in when and how sex happened inside their marriages? Some records show that wives could refuse their husbands under certain conditions, during religious fasting days, illness, or if they were being mistreated. Some even wrote letters complaining of roughness or neglect. But others were clearly trapped. Their bodies were part of the dowry, part of the estate, part of the long list of assets a marriage consolidated. So while legal theorists talked about consent, real-life castle politics often overrode it. Still, not all marriages were cold-blooded business arrangements. Some couples grew to love each other. Letters between noble spouses occasionally survive, full of tenderness and longing. A knight away on campaign might write to his wife about missing her, about their children, about the warmth of her presence beside him. And some noble women wielded quiet influence in the bedroom, negotiating affection through charm, conversation, or even carefully timed headaches. That said, there was always a tension between duty and desire. What if you weren't attracted to your spouse? What if they were cruel or boring or just flat out smelled like boiled cabbage and defeat? Could you refuse them? Maybe. But it came with risk. If you denied your husband sex too often, he could claim you were endangering the marriage, or accuse you of infidelity. And if you were a man whose wife showed no interest, you might take a mistress or several. Society was generally fine with that, as long as the children didn't interfere with inheritance. Bastards could be acknowledged, sometimes even respected, but never allowed to compete with legitimate heirs. Again, sex wasn't just physical, it was dynastic engineering. So here you are, technically married, theoretically in love, and practically on a schedule. You might be 16, or 13. Your spouse might be twice your age, or younger than you. The church tells you this union is holy. Your family tells you it's patriotic. The servants whisper about whether you'll produce a son. The neighbours already speculate about your connection. No pressure, none at all. And still, Some nights the fire's warm, the wind is calm, and your partner looks at you with something kind in their eyes. You hold hands under the covers and talk about the future, not in terms of treaties or titles, but something smaller, personal, human, a garden you want to plant, a song they sang when they were young, a hope for peace, for health, for something soft in a world made of stone. It's rare, but it's there, even in a castle built for war. Let's say you've survived the marriage feast, more mead, some slightly overcooked pigeon, and the guests are finally shuffling toward their rooms, drunk on wine and gossip. You're ushered upstairs, cheeks flushed from heat and nerves, heart pounding behind layers of embroidered fabric. You might think you're headed for a quiet moment alone with your new spouse. You're not. You're heading into one of the most awkward traditions medieval castle culture had to offer, the bedding ceremony. Yes, this was real. And no, it wasn't subtle. Picture this. You and your new partner are led to the bedchamber by a crowd of chanting, clapping, mildly rowdy guests. Noblemen, priests, your parents, possibly even the local lord who gave you that sheep as a wedding gift. A priest might be there to bless the bed, your in-laws might be there to supervise, and if you're lucky they only stay until you're both under the covers. In some regions, though, a few enthusiastic guests linger longer, ensuring that the marriage is officially and visibly consummated. It wasn't always so dramatic, of course. In later periods, the ceremony evolved into more of a symbolic gesture. Guests would escort the couple to the bed, help undress them down to their linens, tuck them in with much cheering and then leave. But earlier on, sometimes it really was that blunt. A room full of people stood there until the couple got started, offering encouragement like they were cheering for a jousting match. Welcome to romance feudal style, and it mattered. A marriage wasn't legally binding until it was consummated. If one side later wanted to challenge the union, they could claim it never happened. That led to public trials, interrogations, and even examinations of the couple's physical condition. Truly humiliating and weirdly detailed affairs where judges determined the validity of your wedding based on bruises or bedding stains. Now here's a strange but historically recorded moment. In some noble families, the stained sheets were paraded around the castle the next day as proof. Or, if you were extra fancy, embroidered cloth was laid beneath you during the bedding, specifically designed to catch any evidence of your newly forged union. Some couples faked it. Some probably just tried to be quick. Some, well, never made it through the pressure at all. One famous case? Margaret of Scotland and Louis XI of France. She was just 15 when they married, and reportedly she was so terrified of the ceremony that she fainted. The French court mocked her accent and manners, and her husband avoided her. They never had children. She died young, possibly from stress or illness. It's a sobering reminder that beneath all the pomp and tradition, real people, especially young women, were often caught in rituals far beyond their control. But not every bedding night ended in trauma. Sometimes the couple genuinely liked each other. Sometimes they laughed through the awkwardness, clutched hands under the sheets, and whispered nervous jokes while the crowd finally filtered out. There were no guarantees, but there were moments of grace. And of course, not all marriages were first-timers. If you were remarrying, or if your spouse was much older or already had heirs, the ceremony might be skipped entirely or toned way down. But for two young nobles, this was the performance of a lifetime, and no one cared how scared or uncomfortable you might be. Let's not forget the servants during all this. Maids and pages prepared the room, fluffed the straw mattress, warmed stones or coals to tuck under the bedding. They laid out nightclothes, poured wine to ease nerves, maybe whispered advice if you were lucky enough to have a sympathetic handmaid. And then they stepped back and waited, outside or just beyond the curtain, to carry out the morning after cleanup. Your first sexual experience, your honeymoon, was for many less candlelight and roses, more administrative duty and public theatre. Quirky side note, in some regions fertility symbols were left in the room, fertility cakes shaped like genitals, wooden phalluses carved into bedposts, or charms sewn into pillows. You weren't just expected to perform, you were expected to succeed. The pressure was intense. You were a womb with a political deadline, a seed with a duty to sprout. There's a lingering scholarly debate over how common or theatrical bedding ceremonies truly were across all of medieval Europe. Some historians argue they were exaggerated in literature and mostly symbolic in real life. Others believe they were very real, especially among the upper nobility. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. In some castles, the ceremony was a boisterous, uncomfortable affair. In others, a quiet, prayerful procession. Either way, it was rarely private. And the psychological weight of it, enormous. Imagine being a teenager, married off for strategy, already overwhelmed by unfamiliar surroundings, and now expected to be emotionally, physically, and politically competent in the bedroom, with a literal audience. You didn't get time to figure things out. No soft lighting, no reassuring talks about boundaries. You were thrown into a new role, and everyone was watching. But still, once the candles burned lower and the room finally emptied, once the embroidered sheets were smoothed and the ceremonial wine was finished, there was a chance, however small, that what remained was two people trying to figure out how to be together. Trying to make something human out of something ceremonial. It wasn't always love, but sometimes it was a beginning. Some couples, having endured the bedding ritual together, found a strange kind of bond in the shared absurdity. They survived the same theatre, they bore the same weight of expectation, and in that they built the first blocks of trust, or at least tolerance. So now the door is closed, the guests are gone, and the fire is almost out. Your new spouse lies beside you, just as nervous, just as unsure. There's laughter still echoing down the halls, and somewhere, a bard is singing a bawdy tune about newlyweds and chamber pots. But here in this stone room, there's only you and another person, both of you fumbling toward adulthood, partnership, and a world that expects too much too fast. And with that awkward night behind you, the rest of the castle, and your new life, awaits. Now comes the real test. How do you make something real in a world built on pretense? You'll figure it out, or you won't. Either way, the bedding ceremony's over, and your name is inked into history. Let's not sugarcoat it. Not all bedroom encounters in medieval castles were rooted in love, duty, or even consent. Some of them were murkier, entangled in power, fear, and the heavy silence of a time that didn't always recognise a woman's right to say no. Tonight we peel back the heavy velvet curtain on one of the darkest realities of medieval intimacy. What it meant when consent wasn't even part of the vocabulary. So, you're a noblewoman in a stone fortress, raised to be obedient, pious and fertile. Your marriage wasn't your choice. You were traded, essentially. A dowry for a border, a womb for a land deal. From the outside you live in luxury. Silk gowns, embroidered pillows, a private maid to brush your hair. But none of that protects you once the door shuts and you're expected to submit, whether you want to or not. The church, ever present and deeply entwined in private life, preached that sex within marriage was holy, even sacred, but only if performed with moderation and the intention to create life. That might sound like moral guidance, but in practice, it often justified the erasure of consent. Husbands were told it was their right, almost their duty, to have access to their wives' bodies. Wives, meanwhile, were told that denying sex could damn them. The threat wasn't just social, it was spiritual. And that made saying no incredibly dangerous. If you did refuse, even quietly, you risked accusations of being a bad wife, of harbouring sin, or of worse, driving your husband into the arms of a mistress or prostitute, which would then be your fault too. It's a twisted circle. You're denied autonomy, and when the consequences unfold, the blame still lands at your feet. Even outside of marriage, the concept of consent was slippery. Lords had immense authority over everyone in their households. Maids, kitchen girls, seamstresses, and even visiting noblewomen were all under their power, and sometimes that power was abused. These weren't whispered scandals, they were openly acknowledged risks. Parents warned their daughters about serving in a large house, not because of the workload, but because of the men. They knew. Let's take a historical detour. One of the most debated examples comes from the legend of droit du seigneur, the supposed right of the lord to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night. Popularised in literature and films, it paints a dramatic picture of feudal exploitation. But here's the twist. Most historians now believe it's more myth than truth. There's little legal evidence such a custom ever existed formally, but the myth persists because, in practice, powerful men did take advantage of lower status women, even if it wasn't sanctioned by law. The system didn't need to write it down, it tolerated it through silence, and women weren't the only ones affected. Young male servants, pages, squires, were sometimes subjected to exploitation by older nobles or aristocratic women. Same-sex abuse, though rarely acknowledged in records, did occur. The silence around it was deafening. These castle walls heard everything but said nothing. So where could someone go for help? Technically, a woman could report abuse to a priest or even take her complaint to a local court. But justice was rare, especially when the accused held land, title, or gold. A poor maid's word carried little weight against a knight or baron. If she became pregnant, she might be dismissed, or forced to give up the child. In some cases, she could be married off to a low-ranking servant to save face. In others, she simply disappeared from the records, and the punishment for rape, harsh on paper, but rarely enforced when nobility was involved, a peasant raping another peasant might face execution or mutilation, a noble doing the same. At worst, a fine, at best a quiet relocation to another estate. Here's a curious legal fact. In some medieval jurisdictions, a woman could only claim she'd been raped if she screamed loud enough to alert nearby witnesses. If no one heard, it was assumed she must have consented. Let that sink in. Your trauma was measured by your volume, and whether someone believed you afterward. But even within these grim parameters, some women fought back. One castle record from 14th century France tells of a maid who brought formal charges against a steward. The trial dragged on for months, and though she was eventually dismissed from service, the steward faced public disgrace. It's a rare case, but a reminder that resistance, however dangerous, was possible. Now, you might be wondering, was it always this bleak? No, not every nobleman was a tyrant. Not every marriage was cold or violent, but the system itself was stacked against those with less power. That's the key thing. Even when kindness or mutual respect existed, it did so in spite of the rules, not because of them. And what about the church? The ever-watchful eye of God's appointed on earth. Priests were often the only figures someone could turn to, but that didn't guarantee safety. Some priests truly acted as protectors, advocating for women, offering sanctuary in convents, even testifying in court. Others abused their positions, knowing that confession gave them access to people's most vulnerable moments. It's a hard truth. Not even sacred walls were always safe. There's still debate among scholars about how frequently coercion occurred in noble homes, simply because many records are missing, or deliberately omitted. Diaries rarely say, "Today, I forced my wife." Legal scrolls use vague phrases like dishonoured or took advantage. The result? A foggy historical picture with sharp, painful outlines. And yet, through all of this, resilience shines. Women formed quiet networks, maids helping each other, noblewomen writing coded letters, abbesses taking in abused wives. Some used their wit and social cunning to maneuver out of dangerous situations. Some ran. Some even poisoned their abusers, carefully over time, with herbs like monkshood or belladonna. Desperate acts, but real ones. There were no easy exits, but there were cracks in the stone where resistance grew. So now imagine yourself as one of these women. Maybe a countess locked in a cold marriage. Maybe a servant avoiding the eye of the steward. You learn to move silently, to read faces, to anticipate danger. You hold your secrets tight and trust sparingly, and if you're lucky, you find small islands of safety, another maid's kindness, a sympathetic confessor, a hidden place behind the chapel where no one follows. That's how you survive. Sex in medieval castles wasn't just about love, lust, or lineage. Sometimes it was a weapon, sometimes it was endured, and sometimes it was reclaimed, quietly, stubbornly, by those who refused to let silence be the final word. You wake to the sound of bells echoing through the stone halls, matins maybe, or a summons to the chapel. Another day, another series of obligations disguised as rituals. But before you even roll out of your creaking bed, one thing is certain. Whatever happened in that bed last night isn't just private. It's a legal matter. In a medieval castle, sex didn't just affect your personal life. It was bound up with law, property, and your place in society. Welcome to the world of sex as a legal tool. Let's start with a fact that still surprises people. Consummation had legal consequences. If you were married and didn't consummate the marriage, the union could be declared invalid. No heir, no property transfer, no alliance. This wasn't a small technicality. Entire wars were launched on the basis of who had, or hadn't, successfully slept with whom. A noble's word might carry weight, but without consummation, a wedding was just a feast followed by nothing, which is why some families kept track. Not just gossip and innuendo, records, eyewitness accounts, affidavits, bloody sheets, in extreme cases. Your love life was someone else's legal brief. And when it came to inheritance, things got even trickier. Suppose you're a nobleman who dies suddenly in battle, or worse, of dysentery in a particularly unglamorous castle lavatory. Who inherits your land? If your wife can prove the marriage was consummated, she might have a claim. If she's pregnant, her status is elevated. If she's not, and no heir exists, the land could revert to your brother, your cousin, or even your liege lord. That's why widows were watched so closely. Their wombs were political time bombs, ticking toward either a rightful heir or a legal vacuum. And here's where things get downright bizarre. In some disputes, noble women were called to testify about the details of their sex lives to prove inheritance rights. Not in vague terms either. Specific nights, positions, frequency. In front of a panel of men with ink-stained fingers and long judgmental beards. No one ever said medieval law was subtle. Let's say you're a young widow. Your husband died without signing the estate over to you, but you insist you're carrying his child. The court might place you under observation for several months to verify the pregnancy. In the meantime, you'd be sequestered, guarded from other men, lest someone tamper with the evidence. It's like a 9-month lockdown, but without Netflix and with a lot more soup. Quirky legal tidbit of the day. There was a clause in some regions called proof of potency. If a woman wanted to annul a marriage due to her husband's impotence, the court might order a physical test. He'd be examined by a panel, yes, a literal panel, of officials and sometimes midwives to determine whether he was capable of performing his duties. If he failed, the marriage could be dissolved. If he passed, the court might order the couple to keep trying for a specific amount of time, with witnesses verifying that attempts were being made. Imagine being on that assignment. But legal stakes didn't stop at noble bedrooms. Even servants and peasants could find their sex lives dragged into court. For instance, say a young maid is found to be pregnant. If she isn't married, the question becomes, who's the father, and what does he owe? Enter the bastardy case. These were common in castle towns and even within the walls. The woman might be brought before a local lord or church tribunal, questioned, pressured, and often forced to name the man. If he confessed, he might be ordered to marry her, pay a fine, or offer support. If he denied it, the case could drag on for months with witnesses trotted out to testify about who saw what, when, and where. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Bastards, illegitimate children, were everywhere. Noblemen often had multiple children outside of wedlock. These kids could be acknowledged, educated, even given roles in the household or military, but they couldn't inherit land. That rule drew a hard, bright line between legitimate and not. And that line? It was drawn with sex. Who had it, when, with whom, and what the church and the law had to say about it afterward. Sex could even be used to invalidate a marriage. If a bride was found to have had premarital sex with someone else, especially if she hadn't confessed, it could be grounds for annulment. In one recorded case, a lord's marriage was undone because it was revealed that the bride had slept with a servant years earlier. She lost her title, her lands, and her social standing overnight. Her husband remarried within weeks. She joined a convent. Meanwhile, certain crimes of passion were also dealt with through legal proceedings. Adultery wasn't always punishable by death, but it was punished. Fines, public penance, even banishment from the castle were on the table, and not equally, of course. A noblewoman caught cheating risked everything. A nobleman, he might just pay a tax and move on. And here's a truly fringe fact. In some rare cases, trial by combat was used to settle sexual disputes. If a woman accused a man of rape, and there were no witnesses, he could demand trial by battle. The woman, or a male champion on her behalf, would fight the accused. If the accuser's champion won, guilt was proven. If he lost, the accusation was considered false, and the punishment shifted to her. It sounds medieval because, well, it was. Brutal, theatrical, and utterly disconnected from what we'd consider justice. So here you are, sitting in a stone-walled chamber with tapestries fluttering against the draught. You've just spent the night with your spouse, or maybe someone else, and you're aware, painfully, that it's not just about feelings, it's about law, about witnesses, about who knows and who can use that knowledge. Sex isn't private, it's paperwork, it's politics, it's proof. You might trust your partner, but you definitely don't trust your steward, or your in-laws, or the chaplain who seems to have a little too much interest in your spiritual health. The room may be warm, the moment soft, but outside the walls there are scrolls, seals, and signatures waiting to turn your body into a battleground. This is what makes intimacy so precarious in a castle. It's never just between two people, it's between families, between dynasties, between church and crown. And if you think you can escape that weight with a little secrecy and a locked door, remember this. The walls here talk, the law here listens, and nothing stays secret forever. You've barely finished your morning bread and cheese before someone reminds you that your soul is at stake. Again. Welcome to the ever-present shadow of the church, keeper of morals, judge of your behaviour, and yes, occasional audience member in your bedroom. Because while the castle might be your home, the church is your conscience, and it doesn't sleep, especially when it comes to sex. In medieval life, religion wasn't something you kept to Sunday mornings. It shaped every hour of your day, from the prayers you mumbled before meals to the saints you invoked before, well, climbing into bed. And while a knight might worry about his sword arm, and a lady her social graces, everyone worried about sin, especially sexual sin. Because the church had thoughts, lots of them, loud ones. So let's set the scene. You're in the confessional. The priest sits on one side of a wooden screen, you kneel on the other. It's dim, quiet. You've been told that your soul depends on this. And then the questions start. Have you been impure in thought? Have you touched yourself? Have you lain with your spouse in a way that wasn't solely for procreation? Did you enjoy it too much? Yes, enjoying sex was, according to certain church teachings, suspect. Pleasure wasn't the point. Procreation was. Sex was a necessary act to continue the species, and preferably, you'd feel slightly guilty afterward. The holiest approach? Celibacy. The next best thing? Married, missionary position, baby-making sex. Anything outside that narrow path? Dangerous. Possibly damning. And these weren't just abstract ideas tossed around in cathedrals. Parish priests were tasked with drilling this into the population, especially during Lent, Advent, and other penitential seasons. You might get a stern reminder in a sermon: no sex during fasts, no sex on feast days, no sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, or Fridays. Some periods of the year were basically off limits altogether. One chronicler joked that if a couple actually obeyed all the church's rules, they'd be celibate half the year. Probably not a joke. But it wasn't just when you had sex, it was how. The church wasn't afraid to get detailed. Manuals written for confessors listed prohibited acts, often in excruciating specificity. Anything too enthusiastic, problematic, oral sex, definitely a sin. Rear entry, standing up, more than once a night, all flagged as morally dangerous. Even married couples were told to confess if they got too creative or too passionate. Now here's a strange historical fact. There were entire guides written for priests on how to interrogate people about their sexual lives. These weren't vague instructions. They were step-by-step breakdowns of what to ask, what to listen for, and how to assign penance. One famous text advised priests to ask not just what act occurred, but whether the person took pleasure in it, and whether their partner did too. If that's not invasive enough, some guides even suggested questioning people on whether they imagined someone else during the act. And if they did? More penance, always more penance. Let's take a moment here to appreciate the mental image. You've just survived a particularly grueling week in the castle, possibly a siege, definitely some food shortages, and now you're on your knees, telling a priest whether your spouse whispered something suggestive before rolling over. Forgive me, Father, for I have flirted, and don't think nobles got a pass. In fact, they were often more scrutinised, precisely because their behaviour had ripple effects across the realm. If a baron was openly keeping a mistress, the church would often step in, not necessarily out of moral concern, but because it undermined social order. Scandal led to instability. Instability led to conflict. Better to keep everything neat, proper, and married. But of course, the hypocrisy was thick enough to butter bread with. Monks and priests were not, despite their vows, immune to desire. Some led double lives, chastity by day, indulgence by night. Abbeys had their scandals, convents their whispered rumours. There are records of entire religious orders being investigated for, shall we say, extracurricular activities. and while some priests genuinely tried to uphold the standards they preached, others used the confessional to control, to shame, or to gather dirt on powerful people. So what did ordinary people do with all this pressure? They got clever. Some nobles paid off their confessors for leniency. Others developed creative excuses. My wife insisted it was a full moon. The bed was already warm, you understand. Some just ignored the rules altogether, figuring they could always confess later, toss a coin into the offering plate, and chalk it up to divine forgiveness. And then there were the indulgences. Ah yes, the ultimate medieval get-out-of-hell-free card. Commit a sin, buy an indulgence, sleep with your servant during Lent. A few silver coins and a prayer might smooth things over. The church needed money for cathedrals after all. And your guilty conscience? That was a lucrative business model, but not everyone could afford to bend the rules. For poorer castle dwellers, servants, maids, guards, confession was often a source of deep fear. A single slip of the tongue could lead to harsh penance or public shame. You might be ordered to fast for weeks, sleep on the floor, or walk barefoot through town reciting prayers. In some cases, people were forbidden to take communion until they'd cleansed themselves fully. Imagine being denied the only spiritual comfort available to you because of a whispered kiss behind the stables. There's still debate among scholars about how strictly these rules were enforced. Some argue that confession manuals were more idealistic than realistic, blueprints for purity that most people quietly ignored. Others insist that the psychological weight of sin haunted people, shaping their desires, their fears, and their marriages. It's likely both are true. Some confessed, some lied, some just hoped that God had a sense of humour. So here you are again, sitting in the chapel's quiet stone vault, the scent of wax and incense in the air, knowing that last night's affection might need a spiritual cleansing. Maybe you whisper the truth, maybe you downplay it, maybe you say nothing at all. But the thought lingers. Did you sin by enjoying it? Did you stray too far from the narrow path? And if you did, what now? Because in this world, sex isn't just physical, it's spiritual warfare. The battlefield is your soul, and the enemy might just be your own desire. By now, you've probably figured out that sex in medieval castles wasn't just inconvenient or overly supervised, it was a minefield of expectation, guilt, and social choreography. And yet, despite all the rules, the layers of surveillance and the omnipresent threat of eternal damnation, people still wanted, they still yearned, they still got creative. And that brings us to tonight's deliciously complicated chapter, Forbidden Desires. Every castle, no matter how devout or militarily focused, had its secrets. Behind the honour, the alliances, and the portraits of solemn ancestors, there were side glances, heated letters, and rendezvous behind chapel columns. Because desire doesn't check someone's lineage before it arrives, and often it arrived exactly where it wasn't supposed to. Let's say you're a married noblewoman. Your husband is off fighting some minor border war or visiting a cousin 3 counties away. He's been gone for months. You're surrounded by courtiers, pages, visiting knights, and that one steward who always lingers just a little too long when handing you the household accounts. And one day, something shifts. A look lasts a beat too long. A casual touch brushes skin. You know it's dangerous, catastrophic even, but it's also thrilling in a way nothing else is. Affairs were common, especially among the noble classes, not because people didn't believe in fidelity, but because marriage wasn't based on love to begin with. It was a political institution, and while some couples grew fond of each other, many didn't. Emotional and physical needs weren't going away, so people found workarounds. Discreet ones, ideally. Letters were the first battleground of temptation. Nobles became experts in coded language. A conversation about the harvest could mean a midnight meeting. Your falcon flies boldly might be praise for something entirely unbird-related. These letters were often written in Latin or French, depending on the region, and sent via trusted servants, or hidden in books, sleeves, or even pies. Yes, pies. There are records of notes smuggled inside baked goods. Nobody checks the stuffing in a goose. And here's the fringe fact of the night. Castles sometimes had secret passageways, not just for escape during sieges, but for moving discreetly between chambers. These weren't just the stuff of fantasy novels. Narrow stairwells built inside walls, crawl spaces connecting chambers, concealed doors behind tapestries. Useful for security, yes. Also, extremely handy for affairs. That guard who disappears for an hour on patrol. That lady's maid who always lingers in the solar after curfew. You can guess why. But it wasn't just nobles fooling around with other nobles. Sometimes the most forbidden affairs crossed class lines entirely. A countess and a kitchen boy, a knight and the washerwoman. These were scandalous not just for being adulterous, but for violating the rigid social hierarchy. If discovered, the consequences were brutal and deeply unequal. For the lower status partner, it could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. A maid accused of seducing a lord might find herself accused of witchcraft or labelled a temptress. A knight who slept with a nobleman's wife could lose his title or his life. Yet it still happened. Repeatedly. Passion doesn't care about your coat of arms. One particularly juicy historical scandal. Isabella of Angoulême, Queen of England and widow of King John, allegedly took several much younger lovers after her husband's death, one of whom was a knight of her household. The affair sparked fury from the French crown and led to Isabella retreating to a nunnery. Whether she went willingly or not is still up for debate, but the message was clear. Powerful or not, women's desire was always policed. And let's not forget the servants. While nobles played with fire and passed love notes between goblets of wine, servants navigated their own labyrinth of danger and desire. Unlike nobles, they didn't have the luxury of locked doors or private rooms, so they made do, with hurried meetings in storerooms, whispered promises on the stairs, and blanket sharing that occasionally turned into something more. But these relationships weren't all romance and rebellion. Power was everywhere. A lord's wink to a maid wasn't always flattering. It could be threatening. Saying no might cost her job. Saying yes might still end with shame. Even if both parties felt something real, the power dynamic tilted hard, and survival often meant pretending to want what you couldn't refuse. And sometimes, affairs were arranged, yes, arranged, to serve political ends. A noblewoman might sleep with a rival lord to gather information. A lady-in-waiting might be encouraged to entertain a visiting knight to secure a treaty. This wasn't romantic. It was espionage in bedsheets. And for the women involved, it was a balancing act between seduction and sabotage. Scholars still debate how often these affairs truly occurred. Letters and poems give tantalizing hints, but hard proof is rare. Lovers rarely left behind journals detailing their trysts. Most of what we know comes from court records, accusations, and occasional bursts of poetry that seem just a little too personal to be purely artistic. And then there are the rumours, hundreds of them, passed down through local law and family histories, whispered names, winks buried in chronicles, enough smoke to suggest plenty of fire. Now imagine the emotional toll. Living in a castle meant being surrounded constantly by people, family, staff, guards, advisors. Every moment of privacy had to be stolen. Every word had to be guarded. Every glance measured. The stress of hiding desire could be just as heavy as the danger of expressing it. But for many, the risk was worth it. Because in a world where marriages were cold, love letters contraband, and privacy a fantasy, forbidden love offered something radical. Choice. To choose someone, anyone, not assigned to you. Not strategic, not sealed with a wax-stamped agreement between fathers. Just yours, even if only for a moment. So here you are, sneaking back to your room with cheeks flushed and pulse still racing. Maybe nothing happened. Maybe everything did. You smooth your gown, you wipe a letter clean of fingerprints, you pass a servant in the hall and nod like you've just been in the chapel, and for now your secret is safe. But the walls remember, the shadows whisper. And that thrill you feel? It might be the first real choice you've made in months. Let's shift the gaze now, just slightly. Because up until now, you've mostly been imagining yourself as someone trapped within the system. A noble bride, a weary servant, a whispering adulterer risking it all behind a curtain. But what if you had the power? Not just the emotional kind, but the kind that bends hallways around your footsteps and makes people lower their gaze when you walk past. Let's talk about the women who didn't just survive the castle, they ran it. And sometimes, they did it from the bed. Noble women weren't always submissive, saintly, or silent. In fact, some of them played the game of sex, marriage, and influence like master strategists, rewriting the rules even while pretending to follow them. You know the type. That lady of the castle with the perfect smile, the flawlessly arranged hair, and a secret stash of love letters hidden behind the third drawer of the chapel altar. She didn't just entertain guests, she selected them, and occasionally she seduced them. First things first, a high-ranking noblewoman often wielded real power, especially when her husband was away. She oversaw the estate's finances, managed staff, handled supplies, and made decisions about everything from building repairs to feasts. In other words, the lady of the house wasn't fluffing pillows and daydreaming. She was running a small kingdom, and with power came opportunity. A classic historical example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France, then Queen of England, and a force of nature in her own right. Not only was she fiercely political, she surrounded herself with poets and troubadours, encouraging a romantic culture we now call courtly love. This wasn't just about pretty sonnets, it was about structured flirtation, a game of manners, words, and erotic tension played by both men and women in noble courts. And Eleanor wasn't just a patron, she was the architect. In the courtly love tradition, the woman often held the upper hand. Knights and poets were expected to pine, to suffer, to earn her affection through service, loyalty, and poetic devotion. Sex wasn't guaranteed. In fact, it was often forbidden. But the emotional intensity, off the charts. It created a space where a noblewoman could feel admired, powerful, even worshipped, all within a socially acceptable framework. But not every lady stuck to poetry. Some took lovers, boldly, discreetly, with all the risk that came with it. If she was clever, she picked someone loyal. If she was reckless, someone ambitious. And if she was really dangerous, someone tied to her husband's political enemies. You can imagine how that went. One of the lesser-known figures worth mentioning, Margaret of Tyrol. She annulled her own marriage, a rare act in itself, and manoeuvred politically until she controlled her own territory. Rumours swirled about her love life, of course. That's what people do when they see a woman with power they can't explain. But whether she had lovers or not, she mastered the same game men played. Use alliances to secure land to secure authority, and use authority to write your own rules. Let's not forget another kind of powerful woman in the castle, the widow. Widows had a unique status. They weren't property anymore. No father or husband had legal claim over them. They often retained control of their dowry, estates and homes, and while society expected them to mourn, many wielded their new freedom with quiet glee. Some remarried strategically. Others didn't remarry at all, choosing instead to enjoy a life with a little less oversight and a lot more room for personal indulgence. There are surviving letters from noble widows that read like declarations of independence. One wrote to a potential suitor that she had no interest in taking on another master, having already served two. Ouch! Her former husbands probably rolled over in their graves. Now here's a curious social detail. Women in power were often suspected of using sex to gain more power, even when they didn't. That suspicion was the weapon society used to keep them in check. You were too charming? Must be sleeping with someone. Too assertive? Probably using the bedroom as a bribe. Even celibate abbesses weren't immune. Some were accused of unnatural passions toward their nuns, just for being respected leaders. That's not to say some didn't enjoy their influence. A few did lean into the rumours, allowing mystery to shroud them like a velvet cloak. They wore exotic perfumes, hosted intimate late-night salons, or dabbled in herbal medicine, often labelled as witchy by the men who couldn't explain how they stayed 10 steps ahead. Let's talk wardrobe for a second. You want to signal control in a castle? Do it with fashion. Rich fabrics, jewelled girdles, plunging necklines paired with icy eye contact. Some noble women used their appearance to craft a persona, modest in court, alluring in private. A simple shift in colour or texture could whisper things without saying them. Crimson for boldness, velvet for confidence, fur-trimmed collars that said, "I own this estate and your attention." A fun historical fact. In certain households, noble women kept lovers' tokens. A ring, a piece of ribbon, a carved bone charm hidden in a locked coffer. These weren't just romantic trinkets. They were symbols of control, of memory, sometimes of blackmail. If a lover became a threat, the token became leverage. A delicate silk square could turn into a career-ending accusation. Chess pieces, remember? There's still academic debate over how common female sexual autonomy really was in medieval noble life. Some argue that women were so tightly controlled by family and church that any sense of agency was a fantasy. Others counter that power like water finds cracks to move through. A castle didn't need to be a prison. For the right woman, it could be a stage. So let's imagine, just for a moment, that you're one of them. A lady with sharp eyes and sharper instincts. You play dumb when needed. You let your brother think he's in charge. You let the steward take credit. But behind the scenes, you're pulling threads, arranging marriages, redirecting patrol routes. You're not just navigating desire, you're orchestrating it. And when you choose to be intimate with someone, it's because you want to. Because you know the cost. Because you know the value. The castle might be your cage, yes. But you've turned the bars into levers. You've figured out which doors creak and which keys unlock more than just chests. And when the wind howls down the corridors and the men start arguing in the Great Hall, you sit back in your cushioned solar, sip your spiced wine and smile. Let them fight. You've already won 3 moves ago. All right, it's time to confront the elephant in the torture chamber, chastity belts. You've probably seen the cartoons, some poor guy reaching through a tangled mess of iron straps, while a key dangles around the neck of a scowling duke. Or maybe you've heard the tale of the crusader who, before heading off to war, locked his wife's loins in a metal cage and tossed the key into the sea. But now it's time for a reality check. Because while the image of the medieval chastity belt is burned into pop culture, the truth is murkier and honestly, way weirder. Let's start with what you think you know. The typical chastity belt in modern imagination is a metal contraption, roughly shaped like a pair of underpants from hell, complete with rivets, locks, and terrifying ventilation. Supposedly, it kept a woman pure while her husband was away, ensuring she couldn't have sex even if she wanted to. But here's the twist. Almost all of these belts were either made centuries after the Middle Ages or were intended as satire, not actual wearable devices. The earliest surviving examples of chastity belts that we know exist are from the 16th century, and even those were often displayed as curiosities, not tools of everyday repression. Historians have dug into this topic, often with more awkwardness than they expected, and the overwhelming consensus is that chastity belts were more symbolic than practical. Metal doesn't breathe, it rusts, it chafes. And we're talking about a world where bathing was optional and medical knowledge was, let's say, imaginative. Wearing an iron thong for months or years, you'd be dead of infection before your husband made it past Italy. So why does the myth persist? Partly because it's juicy. It fits into this deliciously dark narrative of the Middle Ages as a time of extreme control, repression, and bizarre morality. But also because chastity, as a concept, was real, and it was enforced, just not usually with keys and ironwork. Let's break that down. A noble woman's virtue was currency. It determined her value in marriage negotiations. It affected her family's standing. It could even influence property rights. If a young woman was thought to have spoiled herself before marriage, it could ruin an alliance, void a dowry, or start a scandal that made its way through every feasting hall in the kingdom. So, families used surveillance, not steel. Chaperones, gossip networks, ever-watchful maids. Girls weren't left alone with men. Doors stayed open. Sisters tattled. Honour wasn't locked away. It was monitored into submission. But that doesn't mean the idea of physical restraint didn't exist. There are texts that mention girdles of chastity, often worn symbolically, like a charm, not an appliance. These were usually made of cloth or leather, tied with symbolic knots, or decorated with prayers and protective symbols. Think more like a wearable warning sign. No entry, spiritual business only. And often they were used for self-restraint. Women entering religious life might wear them as a sign of devotion, not punishment. Now here's your quirky historical tidbit. In one 15th century Italian manuscript, a drawing shows a man buying a metal chastity belt from an armourer, with a giant smirk on his face. The image is satirical, a joke, a medieval meme essentially. Scholars agree it's mocking the idea of sexual control, not documenting a real widespread practice. So yes, the concept existed, but it was probably more of a joke, or a threat, than an everyday reality. There's also the role of fear. Men, especially those leaving on long crusades or diplomatic missions, were deeply paranoid about infidelity, not because they were paragons of chastity themselves, far from it, but because inheritance depended on certainty. If a child was born during their absence, they needed to be sure it was theirs. Enter the metaphorical chastity belt, a psychological leash more than a literal lock. This paranoia often bled into behaviour. Some men forbade their wives from speaking with male guests. Others assigned watchwomen to their brides, middle-aged, loyal and terrifying women whose sole job was to keep young ladies out of trouble. And by trouble, we mean passion, flirtation, and eye contact held half a second too long. But here's the other side of that coin. Women weren't exactly passive in this whole system. Some played into it. A noble woman might act more pious, more submissive, more locked down than she truly was. It made people underestimate her. While they fretted about her virtue, she was slipping notes to the falconer or arranging a secret meeting in the South Tower. The image of the perfectly protected woman was often just that, an image, and many women learned to weaponize it. There's a scholarly debate about this very phenomenon. Some argue that the chastity myth, belt included, was used to project control in an uncontrollable world. A husband on crusade couldn't really stop his wife from doing anything, but imagining her locked up gave him comfort. It was medieval emotional support, ugly, controlling, but psychologically satisfying to the man who wanted to believe he could stop time. Others argue it was less about real belief and more about satire from the start. A cultural in-joke, passed down in letters and art, exaggerated over centuries until it fossilized into fact. So now imagine you're the woman in question. Your husband is leaving for Flanders. He's paranoid. You've heard him mutter about loyalty and legacy. Maybe he gives you a prayer book. Maybe he gives you a lecture. Maybe he gives you a chastity belt. Fabric, decorative, symbolic. Or maybe just a threat disguised as a joke. Don't forget the key. You smile, kiss him goodbye, and watch the dust trail behind his horse vanish down the road. And when night falls, you take out the hidden letter from your sleeve, the one from the tutor, or the stable hand, or no one at all. Maybe it's just a poem you wrote yourself, a little rebellion hidden in rhyme. You may not wear iron, but you carry the weight of expectation, judgment, and the unrelenting demand to remain untouched, unsullied, unimpressed by anything other than duty. But here's the thing about keys. Even when they're imaginary, someone always finds a way to make one. Let's step out of the bedrooms and political bedposts for a moment, and wander into something a little more poetic, though no less tangled. Because while marriages were forged over maps and children born under obligation, there was another current humming beneath it all, one that didn't care for law or lineage. Tonight you find yourself at a feast, music swelling, wine flowing, and your eyes lock with someone across the room. But instead of a scandal, what follows is courtly love, flirtation with rules, desire with etiquette, passion written in metaphors and sealed with sighs. Welcome to the court of love. This wasn't your standard seduction scene. We're talking 12th century France, a cultural revolution bubbling quietly through noble courts. And yes, it's mostly thanks to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Yes, her again. And her band of clever, educated, sometimes very bored aristocrats. Picture this. You're in a candlelit chamber, tapestries fluttering slightly in the breeze, as a group of men and women sip wine and debate questions like, can love exist between spouses? Or, is jealousy a sign of true love or foolishness? These weren't idle musings. They were serious games of intellectual flirtation, where language became foreplay and wit was as potent as perfume. The concept of courtly love was revolutionary. It centered on idealized, often unconsummated affection between a nobleman and a lady, usually a married lady just to keep things spicy. The knight or poet would express devotion, perform noble deeds in her honour and pine like a professional. The lady, she was the judge, the inspiration, the unattainable prize. Sometimes she rewarded him with a smile, a token, or even a dance. Other times she'd toss his poem into the fire because she could. She had the power, and make no mistake, this was a game with rules. Love was to be secret, noble, and filled with suffering. Real agony. If you were too happy, it wasn't true love. If you got what you wanted, well, now it was just lust. The whole system thrived on longing, desire that stretched but never quite touched. Torture, yes, but pretty torture, with rhyming couplets and monograms stitched into tunics. Here's your quirky historical fact. Some courts actually hosted mock love trials, complete with juries and verdicts. People would present real or imagined romantic dilemmas, and the court, usually led by noble women, would rule on whether the love was pure, appropriate, or ridiculous. One recorded debate centered on whether a man could truly love two women at once. The jury decided no. Another addressed whether love could survive after physical intimacy. The jury was split. It's medieval romance meets reality TV court drama. Now, scholars are still arguing about how seriously these courts of love were taken. Some say they were tongue-in-cheek, more of an elegant pastime than anything real. Others argue that they genuinely shaped how nobility talked about, and even experienced romantic desire. Either way, they offered a way to explore emotion in a culture that was normally obsessed with duty and restraint. And here's the strange thing. It gave women a voice, a structured, socially acceptable way to express judgment, standards, even refusal. While a noble woman might have no say in her marriage, she could reject a suitor in courtly love, she could demand poetry instead of obedience, she could accept admiration on her own terms. In a world where her value was often measured by her womb, courtly love made her the object and the judge of desire. Let's not pretend it was perfect, though. There was still imbalance. Many of the poems written by male troubadours depict women as distant goddesses, idealized, not understood. The love described was often more about the man's longing than the woman's actual experience, and sometimes the whole thing was used as a smokescreen, polite code for affairs that were very much consummated behind closed doors. A knight might sing of his lady's virtue by day and crawl through her window by night. But the ideal stuck, and the imagery endured. Heartbreak, devotion, the ache of separation, it's all there, written on parchment, sung to lutes, and whispered in gallery corners. Even as the church disapproved, calling this kind of love frivolous, distracting, even sinful, it flourished. Why? Because people needed it. They needed a framework for the feelings their arranged marriages didn't quite cover. Now imagine yourself at one of these gatherings. You're dressed in your best, velvet trimmed with silver, hair braided and perfumed. You're seated beside a man who's just recited a verse comparing your eyes to stars and your laugh to birdsong. You know it's flattery, but it's artful. And for once, no one's asking for heirs or dowries or obedience. Just your attention, your smile, maybe your scarf if you're feeling generous. And you? You might have written your own poem, folded and sealed with wax hidden inside your sleeve. Maybe it's about him. Maybe it's about someone else entirely. But for a moment, your desires are yours, not dictated by your father, your husband, or your confessor. Just you, playing a game you know how to win. A few feet away, a pair of musicians begins a low, steady melody. The lady beside you leans over and asks, half whispering, whether you believe love is stronger when it's hidden or when it's declared. You don't answer right away. You sip your wine, feel the weight of your thoughts, and smile. Because here, in the court of love, answers aren't the point. The mystery is. So yes, sex in medieval castles was about power and politics, but it was also sometimes about longing too deep to name. About love that never crossed the line but burned brightly just behind it. And while most of the world around you demanded order, alliances and heirs, this strange little theatre of desire was your secret rebellion. Let's venture into a part of the castle rarely discussed in textbooks, and even less so in those romanticised medieval dramas with sweeping orchestras and smouldering glances across banquet tables. Tonight, we're opening a door few dared to knock on in the Middle Ages, and even fewer felt safe walking through. Queerness. Because as much as the historical record tried to smother it, sex in medieval castles was not always straight, not always simple, and definitely not always within the church's blessed little checkboxes. Let's start with a gentle reality check. People have always been queer. They've always loved, desired, and built relationships outside the binaries and expectations their societies handed them. The castle wasn't immune to that. In fact, with all its long halls, same-gendered living quarters, travel restrictions, arranged marriages, and hyper-segregated social lives, it often created the perfect environment for same-sex intimacy to develop, quietly, subversively, and sometimes even tenderly. So picture this. You're a young page or squire apprenticed to a knight. You sleep in the same chamber, polish his armour, bandage his wounds, and ride beside him into skirmishes. You admire him. You maybe adore him. And maybe, late one night, something unspoken is spoken. A gesture lingers, a look is returned, and now the air between you feels different. Or maybe you're a lady in waiting, one of several assigned to a noble woman. You braid her hair in the mornings, listen to her complaints at midday, and lie beside her in the evenings when the castle is too cold and the wind rattles the shutters. There's comfort there. And sometimes there's more. In a world where women were often told that love was duty and marriage was politics, what could be more radical than affection that asked for nothing but itself? But, and this is crucial, these relationships existed under constant threat. The church didn't just disapprove of same-sex love, It condemned it as sinful, unnatural, and in many cases punishable by death. Officially, the church labelled it sodomy, a word that encompassed everything from male-male intercourse to heresy, to occasionally just general deviant behaviour. The laws were vague, and that vagueness was dangerous. It let authorities interpret as harshly as they pleased. Still, records remain. Scattered, cryptic, sometimes clearly biased, but undeniable. There are court cases, letters, and chronicles referencing same-sex relations, especially among the nobility, where surveillance was high and enemies plentiful. A nobleman accused of loving another man could be disgraced, disinherited, or even executed. Not always for the act itself, but for what it represented. Disorder, disobedience, rebellion against the divinely ordered family unit. One of the most famous cases, Richard the Lionheart, King of England and Crusader extraordinaire. Historians have long debated his intimate relationship with Philip II of France. The two kings shared beds, exchanged letters of deep affection, and were repeatedly documented as being inseparable. Some scholars argue it was simply political closeness. Others see something more. The truth we'll never fully know, but the emotional intensity is clear, and the very fact that people still argue about it shows how uncomfortable medieval queerness makes traditional history feel. Here's your quirky fact of the night. In 14th century France, a noble woman named Edith was reportedly born female, but lived as a man, married a princess, and, according to the romance tale based on her life, was only discovered after a miraculous gender transformation. The story reads like folklore, but it reflects a deeper cultural anxiety about gender and a fascination with those who lived beyond its strict boundaries. Even in legend, the medieval mind couldn't stop circling this space outside the binary. Now let's not pretend queerness in the castle was all moonlight and secret glances. There were real risks. If you were caught, you could face flogging, imprisonment, or execution. If you were accused, that alone could be enough to destroy you. And that accusation? It didn't always come from someone righteous. Sometimes it came from a rival, a bitter ex-lover, a jealous brother-in-law. The threat of queerness became a political weapon, one more tool to eliminate someone inconvenient. So people hid. They wrote in codes. They used metaphors. In letters, a man might write, "You are the light in my darkness," and hope that no one noticed how many times he'd sent that same phrasing to one particular night. A woman might leave a carved token beneath a friend's pillow. Friends. Always friends. That's the word everyone used. It kept things safe, vague, deniable, but not all stories end in fear. In some rare cases, love slipped through the cracks. In one obscure chronicle, two noblemen were said to have bound themselves together in eternal brotherhood, and lived on the same estate, never marrying, managing their land together. No one accused them of anything. Maybe they were discreet, maybe they were protected, or maybe their neighbours just decided to let it be. There's an ongoing debate in academia over whether it's fair to call these people gay or queer by modern standards. After all, the concept of sexual identity as we understand it didn't exist back then. People were defined by acts, not identities. You weren't homosexual, you were a man who had committed sodomy, full stop. But language aside, the feelings, the connections, the longing, they were real. They are real. And ignoring them doesn't make them disappear, it just leaves a hole in the story. So imagine this. It's late. The feast is over. The musicians have packed away their lutes. You're in the quiet of the gallery with someone you trust more than anyone. You touch hands for a moment too long. You don't speak. You don't need to. Because here, in this fleeting hour, you found something honest, something sacred even the priest wouldn't understand. You both know the risks, but you also know the truth. This feeling, whatever name it goes by, isn't unnatural. It's human. And in a castle built on rules, secrecy and ceremony, that truth might be the only thing that feels free. Now we step down from the stone towers and noble chambers and follow the scent of onions and tallow to where the real heartbeat of the castle pulses. Below stairs, beyond the tapestries, in the warm, noisy belly of the building, the servant quarters, the kitchens, the stables. Because while lords and ladies were busy negotiating treaties in bed, the people scrubbing floors and pouring wine were carrying out love affairs of their own, some sweet, some scandalous, all raw and human. Tonight you're slipping into the shoes of the people history often forgets. The castle's labourers, whose sex lives were just as real as their masters, if not more. Let's be honest. Servants didn't have silken bedclothes or rooms with locking doors. What they did have was proximity. When you're sharing cramped quarters, sleeping 6 to a room, and working 14-hour days with the same group of people, relationships, emotional and physical, tend to emerge. In fact, many castles were practically built for it. Clusters of young men and women in their teens and 20s, overworked, under-supervised and desperate for comfort. That's a recipe for candlelit chaos. Now, the hierarchy was brutal. If you were a scullery maid, you were at the very bottom. Wet hands all day, cracked skin from scrubbing pans, and clothes that smelled perpetually of smoke and cabbage. If you were a squire or a stable hand, you were slightly better off. More freedom of movement, closer to the knights, and crucially, more time alone in outbuildings. That privacy. Gold dust. And many used it. Imagine 2 maids sneaking into the laundry room after dark, or a cook and a page stealing kisses behind a barrel of mead, or a groomsman and seamstress huddled together in the stables during a rainstorm, straw in their hair and fingers tangled in borrowed time. The noble world upstairs might have been all structure and strategy, but down here, relationships were more improvisational, less ceremonial, messier, more real. Sex among servants wasn't always about love. Sometimes it was comfort, sometimes it was curiosity, sometimes, unfortunately, it was survival. Power didn't vanish just because you were poor, it just changed shape. A steward might offer better rations in exchange for favours, a nobleman's wink might come with expectations, and saying no wasn't always an option. But still, amidst the chaos there were real stories of connection. Lovers who held hands while passing buckets in the courtyard. Couples who passed each other coded messages scrawled in soap on laundry lines. Young women who counted the days until a certain guard's shift returned to her wing. These weren't just side plots in someone else's history. They were entire lives lived in the margins. One quirky historical detail. In some castles, there were actual rules posted regarding fraternization among servants. Not because the nobility cared about morality, but because pregnancies led to lost labour, awkward situations and questions nobody wanted to answer. But did anyone follow the rules? Not really. Castle servants were expert rule benders. They had to be. They found loopholes, back staircases, and corners of the castle forgotten by the architects. One chronicler even wrote of a castle that had a lover's loft above the bakery oven. Warm, secluded and well used. Pregnancy, of course, changed everything. A maid who became visibly pregnant out of wedlock could be dismissed, punished, or worse, blamed for seducing someone of higher rank, even if she was the victim. Some were quietly married off to kitchen boys or guards. Others were sent away to visit family until the child was born. And the child, sometimes kept, sometimes not. Sometimes absorbed into the lower ranks of the castle staff, their parentage whispered about but never confirmed. One haunting case recorded in an English manor involved a young servant girl who gave birth in secret and tried to hide the child's body. She was discovered, put on trial, and executed. The father, believed to be a visiting noble's son, was never even questioned. That's the power imbalance carved into every stone of the keep. But it wasn't always tragedy. Some servant couples genuinely fell in love, married, and built small families within the castle system. They lived in the outer buildings or cottages just beyond the walls, raised children who would become the next generation of staff. In many ways, the castle functioned like a small, self-sustaining village, and love, sex, and heartbreak were as much a part of it as flour and firewood. There's still debate among historians about how much freedom castle servants really had in choosing their relationships. Some argue that the structure was so rigid, so surveilled, that most romances had to be strategic. Others point out that the lower ranks were often left to their own devices, as long as they didn't disrupt the larger household. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Monitored but manoeuvrable. Dangerous but not impossible. And we can't ignore the emotional layer. For many servants, a romantic relationship, however brief, offered more than physical intimacy. It was a break from exhaustion, a sense of being seen, of having someone's name to whisper when the nights got too long or the soup too thin. Even just a shared glance across the corridor could carry a whole story behind it. Now imagine you're one of these people, maybe a chambermaid who hears everything and says nothing, maybe a page who's memorized the rhythm of the cook's footsteps. You work all day, often with numb hands and blistered feet. But tonight, you're lucky. You've slipped into a quiet corner, someone you care about beside you. It's not fancy. There's no soft bedding or fine perfume. Just a blanket, a whispered joke, and the relief of being touched by someone who doesn't want to own you, order you, or pretend you don't exist. For a moment the castle's echo fades. The hierarchy melts. It's just you and another person sharing stolen time. You know the risk. You'll probably lie about it in the morning. But tonight, for this breath of warmth, you're not a servant, you're human. Let's pause for a moment and talk about consequences, not the social ones, or the ones that came from a whisper reaching the wrong ears, but the real, biological, terrifying kind. Because in a medieval castle, sex was never just about desire or politics. It was about pregnancy, about babies born into stone-walled chambers with drafty windows, beds stuffed with straw, and not a single anaesthetic in sight. Tonight, you're thinking about what happened after the candle burned down and the passion cooled, when the body took over and everything changed. Picture it. You're a young noblewoman, newly married, you fulfilled your duties, maybe you even enjoyed them. But now comes the waiting, the signs, the fear, the hope, the scrutiny. Did your courses stop? Are you more tired than usual? Has your appetite changed? Everyone around you notices before you do, the maid whispers to the cook. The cook hints to the steward. The steward drops a comment to the chaplain. Suddenly, your womb is everybody's business. Because here's the truth. Pregnancy wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a political moment. A noblewoman who conceived early in her marriage was celebrated. It meant the alliance was fruitful, the family line secure, the dowry well invested. But if you didn't conceive quickly, the rumours started. Maybe you were barren, maybe you were cursed, maybe, God forbid, it wasn't your husband's fault, and if a child was born too early, people counted the months. If it took too long, people counted again. Time in this context was a weapon. Now, let's move beyond nobility for a second. Servant girls faced their own kind of terror. Pregnancy out of wedlock could mean disgrace, punishment, or outright dismissal. If the father was another servant, maybe there was a chance at marriage, though not always. If he was someone of higher status, forget it. You might be accused of seduction, called a harlot, or simply denied and discarded. Some girls tried to hide their pregnancies, some succeeded, some didn't survive childbirth, and that leads us to the other looming shadow over medieval sex: maternal mortality. You probably didn't make it out of your childbearing years unscathed. In fact, giving birth was one of the most dangerous things a woman could do. Infection, hemorrhaging, breech births, any one of these could kill you. And with no effective pain relief and only the most rudimentary knowledge of anatomy, your best hope was a competent midwife and a strong constitution. Midwives were the unsung heroes of the medieval birthing room. They weren't formally trained, at least not in universities, but their knowledge was real, passed down through generations of experience. They knew how to position the baby, how to coax a slow labour, how to ease pain with herbs and massage. They used pennyroyal, mugwort and rue, not always safely mind you, to influence the outcome of a pregnancy. Some of these herbs acted as early contraceptives or abortifacients, though those terms wouldn't be used for centuries. It was risky, unregulated and largely undocumented, but it was knowledge born of necessity. Let's take a moment for a quirky historical fact. There were birthing charms written on scrolls and pinned above a woman's bed during labour. These weren't spells in the Harry Potter sense. They were religious texts, Latin prayers, or illustrations of saints meant to invoke divine protection. St. Margaret of Antioch was a favourite. She was believed to burst from the belly of a dragon unharmed, which medieval people decided made her the patron saint of surviving childbirth. Makes sense, if you squint. Now, of course, not every woman wanted to become pregnant. Enter medieval contraception, such as it was. You couldn't stroll into a pharmacy or ask your confessor for tips. But there were methods, whispered from one woman to another. Certain herbs were believed to prevent conception when consumed regularly. Some women used pessaries, cloth soaked in vinegar or wine, inserted before intercourse. Others relied on coitus interruptus, or the rhythm method, though timing without a calendar or ovulation test was, let's say, optimistic. And then there were charms, amulets worn on the body, often inscribed with symbols or words thought to ward off conception. One particularly strange example, a dried weasel's testicle worn around the neck. Yes, that was a thing. No, we don't recommend it. Men, of course, weren't completely left out of this equation. They were sometimes told to drink infusions of mint or avoid hot baths, based on the belief that heat affected virility. But let's be honest, the burden of pregnancy prevention fell mostly on women, whether they were noble or peasant, and the consequences of failure, also theirs. There's a scholarly debate about just how widespread medieval contraception was. Some argue that it was relatively common among women who had access to herbs and informal knowledge networks. Others believe it was rare, risky, and largely ineffective. Again, the truth probably lies somewhere in between. In noble circles, contraception may have been taboo, because producing heirs was the point. But among the lower classes, where another mouth to feed could be the difference between survival and starvation, the stakes were different. And what of abortion? It existed, though it was cloaked in euphemism. Midwives might refer to bringing down the flowers, or restoring balance. The church condemned it, of course, but not always consistently. In some periods, termination before quickening, the point at which fetal movement could be felt, was seen as a sin, but not necessarily murder. As with so many things in medieval life, enforcement varied wildly. Now imagine yourself in that narrow birthing room, stone walls closing in, fire flickering low, and the sharp scent of herbs in the air. You grip the hand of the midwife, your body racked with pain, sweat running down your spine. There's no turning back now. Outside the door, your husband waits, pacing, praying it's a boy. The servants whisper. The steward sharpens his quill, ready to record the heir's birth. And you just want to survive. Because love might bring you into that bed. Lust might bring a spark to your life. But pregnancy, that's where the real weight of it all lands. Whether it was feared or prayed for, welcomed or resented, it shaped everything. Your body wasn't just your own. It was a battleground for legacy, for morality, for survival. And sometimes, just sometimes, it was a source of joy. When the baby comes, if it comes, you might cry with relief, or grief, or exhaustion so deep it feels like the end of the world, but you'll breathe, and the castle will mark it down. A child is born, another link in the chain, another story added to the ledger, and life, in all its fragile, aching complexity, goes on. Let's be honest. Power does weird things to people. Gives someone a crown, a kingdom, and a castle full of people required to bow when they sneeze, and things start to unravel behind the curtains. Which brings us to tonight's theme, what happens when kings get bored. Because when you have absolute control and too much time between wars and feast days, sex becomes more than recreation. It becomes a tool, a diversion, a status symbol, and sometimes a full-blown national crisis. In medieval castles, the king's bedroom wasn't just a private space, it was a stage, and sometimes a battlefield. Let's start with a fact. Kings were expected to be virile. This wasn't just locker room boasting, it was tied directly to legitimacy. A strong king fathered many children, ideally legitimate sons, but also a few robust bastards didn't hurt. His sexual prowess was viewed as proof of his strength, his divine favour, even his right to rule. A weak or celibate king. That was political danger, and so, whether he liked it or not, the king's libido became everyone's business. So when he got bored, or let's say curious, the consequences were rarely confined to the bed. Royal mistresses were as much political players as they were lovers. Sometimes they were chosen by the king. Other times they were pushed toward him by ambitious families. A beautiful courtier with the right charm and timing could become the most powerful woman in the realm without ever holding a title. One of the most notorious examples, Edward IV of England. Charming, impulsive, and utterly uninterested in subtlety, Edward had multiple mistresses during his reign, many of whom ended up embroiled in court intrigue, secret pregnancies, and rivalries with his actual wife, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. One mistress, Jane Shore, became so beloved at court that even after Edward's death, she remained politically relevant, until she was dragged barefoot through the streets during a power purge. That's the risk. Be the king's favourite and you shine, until you burn. Meanwhile, King Philip IV of France, aka Philip the Fair, took things in a darker direction. His scandal wasn't about his own affairs, it was about what happened when his daughters-in-law were caught having theirs. The infamous Tour de Nesle affair in 1314 erupted when two princesses were accused of sleeping with knights right under the king's nose. The punishment was severe. The knights were tortured and executed, the women imprisoned for life, and the ripple effects? Devastating. The royal family's image crumbled, the dynasty destabilised, and eventually the Capetian line collapsed into the chaos that led to the 100 Years' War, over sex, just sex, or more accurately, over what sex represented. And then there's Henry I of England, who fathered at least 20 children, most of them illegitimate. 20. That's not a romantic biography, that's a spreadsheet. Henry housed many of these children in castles across the kingdom, gave them good marriages and used them as political pawns. In this sense, sex was his version of empire building. The more bloodlines he extended, the more influence he held. No need to invade when you can simply seduce, procreate and marry your way to dominance. But it wasn't always consensual. Let's not pretend every royal liaison was a candlelit affair between consenting adults. The king's power meant that refusal wasn't always an option. Servants, ladies-in-waiting, even visiting noblewomen were often expected to comply, or else. And though the church technically condemned adultery and sexual coercion, few dared to confront a king. One chronicler even remarked that the law bows at the king's desire as grass bends before the wind. That about sums it up. Now for your quirky historical tidbit, some kings maintained elaborate pleasure apartments within their castles, entire wings decorated, staffed and maintained for entertaining lovers. Think mood lighting, feathered cushions and heated baths. The Château de Vincennes in France allegedly had one such wing, equipped with private staircases and strategically placed guards. Discretion wasn't just desired, it was architecturally reinforced. Of course, royal wives weren't exactly oblivious. Queens knew the game. Some played it with icy grace, maintaining their dignity while quietly consolidating their own power. Others pushed back. Eleanor of Aquitaine, yes, her again, famously led a rebellion against her husband, Henry II, partially fuelled by personal betrayal, and Isabella of France, married to Edward II of England, eventually invaded the country with her lover and overthrew him. Don't underestimate a queen who's had enough. There's a long-standing scholarly debate about how much personal emotion factored into royal affairs. Were kings ever in love with their mistresses? Did they feel guilt, affection, jealousy? Some historians argue that royal relationships were purely transactional. Others point to love letters, poems and grand romantic gestures as proof of genuine feeling. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the messy middle. People are people, even when they wear crowns. But make no mistake, when a king's affections wandered, people noticed. Nobles shifted alliances, courtiers adjusted their flattery, bishops wrung their hands, and for the mistress herself, every step was a dance on a knife's edge. Today you're queen in all but name. Tomorrow a rumour turns and you're shipped off to a nunnery with nothing but a worn ring and a well-dressed scandal in your wake. Imagine being one of these women. You don't control the king, not really. But for a while, you have his ear. You whisper in it during dinner, during walks, during quieter moments behind tapestries. You suggest favours, names, petitions. You smile carefully at his wife. You avoid his mother's eyes. And when he tires of you, and he will, you try to land softly, secure a pension, a property, a retreat. Because you were never permanent. You were a season, a symptom of power's need for novelty. And the king? He moves on. He hosts another feast. He drinks too much. He picks another flower from the garden. History will judge him by his conquests, not his lovers. But those women, they carried the scars, and sometimes the crown's future heir. So yes, when kings got bored, things happened. Sometimes entire wars, sometimes just a hallway scuffle. But always, behind the heavy velvet curtain, someone was taking a risk, and someone else was watching. Quietly, carefully, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Now picture yourself stepping into a different part of the castle entirely, one that echoes not with music and flirtation, but with soft chanting, the rustle of habits, and the subtle scratch of quills on parchment. You're walking down a cloistered hallway, stone cool beneath your bare feet, candlelight flickering on ancient walls. Welcome to the monastery, the convent, the sacred spaces of medieval celibacy, where, surprise surprise, sex still found a way in. Because while monks and nuns vowed chastity, silence and spiritual focus, they were still human. And humans, well, Let's just say the vow of celibacy was more aspiration than guarantee. Let's begin with a reality check. Celibacy was considered one of the highest spiritual callings in medieval Christendom. To deny the flesh was to emulate the angels. Monks and nuns weren't just avoiding sex, they were purifying their souls by renouncing earthly pleasure altogether, in theory. But in practice, not quite so holy. Temptation didn't magically disappear just because you put on a robe and took a Latin name. Now, monasteries and convents were often built in isolated places, partly to protect the spiritual community from worldly distractions, and partly to make it easier to police everyone's behaviour. Men and women lived separately, of course, but that didn't mean isolation was perfect. Monasteries needed supplies, they had labourers, they traded, and sometimes they had guests, occasionally noble ones, occasionally charming, lonely, and way too attentive ones. One particularly spicy historical scandal comes from a 14th century nunnery in Saxony, where a group of nuns was found to be having affairs with local clergy. When questioned, several claimed that their relationships were divinely inspired. One even insisted the Virgin Mary had told her in a dream that her lover was a gift from God. Creative, bold, not convincing to the bishop, who promptly shut the entire convent down and reassigned the women to stricter houses. But the fact that they tried to defend themselves speaks volumes. And it wasn't just nuns. Male monastic communities had their own share of scandal. Letters, trial records, and even church complaints point to frequent breaches of celibacy. Some monks kept lovers secretly housed in nearby villages. Others confessed to long-term relationships with fellow brothers. In one extreme case, an abbot in France was removed after it was discovered he'd fathered several children and was living like a lord. So much for vows. Here's a quirky historical fact for you. Some monasteries had confession booths specifically for monks to admit they'd broken their celibacy vows. Not once, but regularly. In fact, it got so common that certain abbeys just started keeping penance logs to track habitual offenders. 5 Hail Marys, 10 lashes with a switch, a week of fasting, rinse and repeat. Now, it would be easy to write all of this off as hypocrisy, but it's more complicated than that. Many monks and nuns were deeply sincere. They believed in their vows. They wanted to rise above desire, but desire isn't something you can always outrun. Some fell in love, some were lonely, some were manipulated, some simply couldn't resist. And in those moments, the tension between doctrine and desire played out in the most human of ways. Let's not forget that many people didn't choose the monastic life freely. A second or third son with no inheritance, off to the abbey, a daughter deemed too rebellious or too unmarriageable. To the convent she went. Some found peace, others found resentment, and with it, a quiet defiance, a whispered name, a late-night rendezvous in the herb garden, a stolen kiss in the chapel cloister. But what about same-sex relationships? They happened, often, and the church was both obsessed with and terrified of them. Among monks, close friendships were common. Some were platonic, others were not. A few orders encouraged spiritual brotherhoods, where 2 monks pledged deep emotional and spiritual bonds to one another. In some cases, those bonds blurred into something more physical. And in convents, letters between nuns sometimes hint at deep romantic attachment, some tender, some clearly passionate. Again, it's hard to pass what was emotional intensity versus romantic desire, but the heat is there. Still, the consequences could be severe. If caught, monks and nuns could be defrocked, excommunicated, or worse. Punishments range from being sent to distant, isolated monasteries to public penance or corporal punishment. One particularly infamous case involved a nun who was flogged in front of the entire convent after being caught sneaking out to meet her lover, a priest, naturally. The public nature of the punishment wasn't about justice, it was about deterrence. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much sexual behaviour occurred behind monastery walls versus how much was exaggerated by reformers and rival clergy trying to push puritanical reforms. Some argue that records are biased, inflated to make certain monasteries look corrupt. Others point to the sheer volume of accusations as evidence that celibacy, for many, was never fully sustainable. The truth, predictably, lies in the middle. Not everyone broke their vows, but enough did to leave a paper trail. And yet, despite the failures, the desire to be celibate was real. For many, the monastery was a sanctuary, a place to escape the demands of marriage, family, or political marriage markets, a place where your value wasn't tied to how many heirs you produced, or how obediently you lay in bed. In that sense, celibacy was its own kind of freedom, if you could maintain it. Now imagine you're a nun in a modest stone convent tucked into the edge of a forest. Your days are structured by bells, prayer, work, reflection. You tend the herb garden, copy illuminated manuscripts, and sing vespers in the flickering candlelight. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone among your sisters whose smile lingers longer than it should. Someone who braids your hair too gently. Someone who, during long nights of prayer, seems to sit just a little closer than necessary. You don't act on it. Maybe you never will. But the feeling is there, powerful, complicated, and very much alive. Or maybe you're a monk, silent in the scriptorium, eyes aching from hours of copying Latin. You look across the room and find another brother looking back. Neither of you speaks, but the recognition is mutual. You both made vows. You both know the stakes. But for a moment, in the hush of the ancient walls, you allow yourself to feel it. Because even in the most sacred of spaces, desire still whispers. It doesn't care about your robe, your tonsure, or your vows. It waits, patient, quiet, human. Tonight, we're setting aside the heavy politics, the family alliances, and even the church's pointed glare, and entering the flickering realm of the supernatural, where lust meets legend and desire gets mixed into potions, charms, and whispered incantations. Welcome to the world of medieval love magic. Because in a time when control over your own relationships was limited, or outright denied, some people turned to forces older, stranger, and far less predictable than law or religion. If you couldn't have the person you loved, maybe you could make them love you. And if your body didn't do what it was supposed to, maybe the right route, charm, or prayer could nudge it in the right direction. Picture yourself huddled in the smoky corner of a market stall, the air thick with crushed herbs and secrets. The woman before you, a healer, a midwife, or maybe a half-feared local wise woman, hands you a small pouch. Inside, dried berries, a twist of cloth, a handwritten scrap with words in Latin you can't read. She tells you to hide it under your lover's pillow, or to sprinkle the mixture into his wine at the next feast. Will it work? She doesn't promise anything. But you hand over your coin anyway, because desperation is louder than reason. Love magic was everywhere in medieval castle life, even if it rarely made the official records, because of course it wasn't supposed to exist. The church labelled it witchcraft, sin, and heresy. But people still used it. Noblewomen especially were suspected, and sometimes outright accused, of resorting to magical means to seduce or bind lovers. And let's be honest, they often had the motive. In a world where marriage was arranged, where desire had to be hidden, and where the slightest misstep could ruin your reputation, a love charm might have felt like the only real power you had. These charms range from simple to outright bizarre. Some involved herbs. Basil, verbena, and yarrow were popular choices. Others used bodily fluids, hair or nail clippings. Stolen, of course, because secrecy was everything. A particularly creepy charm involved baking a piece of one's own hair into a cake and serving it to the object of affection. Bon appetit. Fertility rituals, too, blended natural medicine with full-on superstition. Women unable to conceive were advised to sleep with fertility charms under their pillows, to bathe in water infused with certain plants, or to recite prayers backwards at midnight under a full moon. One ritual called for walking 3 times around a sacred well and offering a token, often a cloth doll or a personal item, to the water. And if all else failed, find a relic. Some shrines claimed to hold bones of saints who specialised in helping barren women. St. Anne was popular, so was St. Gerard. Pilgrimages weren't just about salvation, they were sometimes about conception. Let's throw in tonight's fringe fact. In 15th century Germany, there was a recorded case of a nobleman who accused his wife of using an enchanted girdle to make him impotent. The court was unsure whether the belt was magical, but they did note that every time he wore it, things didn't work. Eventually the belt was burned, the marriage annulled, and the wife exiled. Magic? Maybe. Power of suggestion? Probably. But the fear was very real. In castles, the line between medicine and magic blurred constantly. Midwives often served as unofficial magicians. They knew how to use herbs to ease pain, slow bleeding, or, allegedly, induce arousal. A particularly infamous mixture, sometimes called Cupid's cordial, combined honey, wine, and powdered roots with the hope of stoking desire. The instructions? serve in secret, preferably during a waxing moon, and follow with close physical proximity. Translation: get cozy fast. Of course, men had their own magical fixes. Some noblemen carried philters, small glass vials filled with aromatic oils or symbolic powders meant to increase stamina, charm, or confidence. These weren't unlike modern-day colognes or tonics, except half of them were laced with mercury or powdered lead. Effective, debatable, dangerous, definitely. There's a long-standing scholarly debate over how much people actually believed in love magic versus how much was theatre, fantasy, or last resort theatrics. Some argue it was mostly psychological, rituals that offered hope when nothing else could. Others point to trial records, church edicts, and personal testimonies as evidence that belief was both widespread and sincere. And for some, just going through the motions felt like doing something. When you've been told your desires are sinful or useless, a charm might be the only way to reclaim agency. And of course, it wasn't all innocent. Some love spells crossed into coercion. Attempts to control, bind, or manipulate another person's will, especially in sexual contexts, were seen as a serious breach of both magical ethics and spiritual law. The Church warned that any such interference opened the door to demons, yes, literal demons, who would twist the charm and possess the caster or victim. These warnings, often wrapped in fire and brimstone language, didn't stop people, but they did add a layer of anxiety to an already fraught emotional terrain. Imagine now you're in your solar, a small fire burning low, and you're grinding herbs with a borrowed mortar. You're not a witch, you're just a woman tired of waiting, tired of watching someone else smile at the man you've loved for years. Or maybe you're trying to please a husband who never looks at you. Or maybe you just want a baby, and no one, not your priest, not your physician, has helped. So you turn to this, not because it's safe, not because it's certain, but because it's something. Or maybe you're a young squire, scared out of your mind, about to sneak a love note under a noblewoman's pillow, hoping the sprig of rosemary you tucked in will sway her heart just enough. You've no idea if it works, but the thrill of hope? That's magic enough. These rituals, half wish, half rebellion, were how people coped with the uncontrollable. Love, sex, fertility, desire, none of it came with guarantees. But mix a little honey, whisper a Latin phrase, burn the right kind of wood, and maybe, just maybe, you'd get what you wanted. Or at least feel a little less powerless. And in a world built on obedience, structure and stone, even the tiniest act of magical resistance was a form of freedom. No wonder they kept the charms hidden. No wonder the Church feared them. Because sometimes, belief is the boldest kind of power there is. Tonight, we're not tiptoeing. We're charging headfirst into the darker side of medieval intimacy. Because for all the seduction, power games, whispered spells and stolen glances, there was always a threat lurking just beyond the flicker of torchlight. Disease. Real, relentless, and utterly unforgiving. In a castle where medical knowledge was part guesswork, part superstition, sex didn't just carry the risk of scandal. It could kill you, or worse, leave you alive and marked. This wasn't just about morality or pregnancy anymore. This was about pain, rot, and the creeping terror of something you couldn't see until it was too late. Let's talk about the most infamous of the bunch, syphilis. Now, it didn't explode across Europe until the late 15th century, so your average high medieval castle dweller may not have had a name for it, but they definitely had something like it. The disease may have mutated or arrived later via contact with the Americas. Historians still argue about its exact origin, but the symptoms were unmistakable. Genital sores, rashes, mental decline, and in its worst stages, disfigurement. They called it the French disease in Italy, the Italian disease in France, and the Christian disease in the Ottoman Empire. Everyone blamed someone else. No one had a cure. So what did they do about it? Mostly panic. Then experimentation. Mercury was the treatment of choice. Yes, the actual toxic metal. It was rubbed into the skin, injected, or even inhaled as vapour. The thinking went, what burns the body must purge the sickness, and purge it did. Patients suffered tooth loss, organ failure and madness, not always from the disease but from the cure, and yet it remained popular for centuries. You'd often hear the phrase, a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, and people said it with a nervous laugh that barely masked the fear. But syphilis wasn't alone. Gonorrhea was also common, less deadly, but no less humiliating. It caused painful urination, pus-filled discharge, and in severe cases, infertility. Without antibiotics, which wouldn't show up for another 500 years, thank you penicillin, treatment was medieval in every sense of the word. Leeching, hot irons, herbal poultices smeared on body parts that didn't appreciate being smeared. If your infection didn't kill you, the cure might, or at the very least it left you walking funny and praying extra hard at the chapel. And for women, the suffering was often doubled, not just because of symptoms, but because they were blamed. If a nobleman caught something, he often pointed the finger at a maid, a prostitute, or even his own wife. Women were accused of being polluted, venomous, or, wait for it, cursed below the belt. There's even a recorded case of a noblewoman in Germany who was accused of bewitching her husband after he developed sores. The fact that he'd been with half the court? Irrelevant. Quirky historical tidbit. One popular belief held that a man could cleanse himself of disease by sleeping with a virgin. Yes, really. This horrific myth led to actual assaults, and was used as a grotesque justification by men desperate and diseased. It's one of those horrifying examples where medieval superstition had devastating real-world consequences, especially for young girls and servant women who had little to no protection from their supposed superiors. And the church? Ah, yes, the church had opinions. Disease was often seen as punishment for sin. Got sores? You must have committed adultery. Your skin's peeling. Should have kept your pants on during Lent. Penance was prescribed alongside leeches. Public shaming sometimes followed. You could confess your sins, of course, but that didn't mean your body would recover. And if it didn't? People assumed your soul was blackened too. Sickness was both a diagnosis and a judgment. Now let's not forget the healers who weren't priests or barbers. The local herbalists, usually women, had their own approach. They used garlic, honey, vinegar, and resinous salves. Some recommended baths in wine or urine. Others offered tinctures of yarrow and sage. Did they work? Sometimes. A few had mild antibacterial properties. Others were just soothing placebo. But at least these women approached illness with care, not steel. There's ongoing scholarly debate about just how widespread sexually transmitted infections were in medieval Europe. Some argue that because the population was smaller and mobility limited, outbreaks were local and slow. Others say the opposite, that close quarters, poor hygiene, and a lack of medical understanding made castles breeding grounds for infection. What we do know is that the fear was real. Symptoms were recorded, remedies were tried, and the shame unmistakable. But here's the wildest twist. Some diseases were romanticised. Pale skin, bloodless lips, languid eyes, signs of anemia or even late-stage syphilis were sometimes mistaken for beauty. In love, poetry and portraits, noble women were described as fragile, delicate, and ethereal. Translation, sickly. One artist's muse might have had tuberculosis, another's tragic heroine was just dying slowly. The blurred line between illness and allure is one of those bizarre historical details that makes you tilt your head and go, huh. Now imagine yourself waking up in your castle chamber, a sore on your thigh, a fever in your bones, and no idea what it means. You're too afraid to tell anyone. You try to pray it away. Maybe you drink rosemary water. Maybe you ask a servant to fetch the quiet apothecary, the one who doesn't ask questions. But you know, deep down, that something's wrong. And you think back to that one night, that one risk. You didn't mean for it to happen, or maybe you did. Either way, now it's yours. Or maybe you're on the other side. A nobleman eyeing the serving girls with less enthusiasm than usual. You've seen a friend lose his nose. Literally. You've seen someone babble nonsense before dying in agony. You tighten your belt. Say a prayer. Decide, at least for now, to keep your desires in check. Not because of the church. Not because of guilt. But because you've seen what happens when pleasure goes too far. Sex in medieval castles came with danger, and not just the emotional or social kind. The physical cost was always lurking, invisible, infectious, often incurable, and when it hit, it wasn't just a private shame, it was a public mark, a scarlet letter shaped like a rash, a limp, a madness that crept in one fever at a time. And yet, people still risked it. They always have. Because for every fear, there was desire. For For every blister, a temptation, and for every cure that didn't work, a night someone thought was worth it. Tonight we wander not into the bedchamber or the buttery, but through a different kind of corridor, one lined with laws, customs, and the always suspicious quills of notaries. Because in medieval castles, sex wasn't just a personal act or a scandalous whisper, it could be a legal transaction. Welcome to the wonderfully uncomfortable world of marriage contracts, annulments, dowries, and, yes, even virginity inspections. This wasn't about love or romance. This was about paperwork, power, and whose body belonged to whom, officially and with witnesses. Let's start at the altar, or more accurately, several steps before the altar. Medieval marriage wasn't a quick affair. For the nobility especially, it was a multi-stage process, usually beginning with betrothal contracts signed when the parties were barely out of the cradle. A noble girl might be promised to a barren son before she could say her own name. These contracts spelled out property exchanges, alliance terms, dowry values, and, this is important, the expectations around consummation. Because until the marriage was physically sealed, it wasn't fully real. You could have a lovely church ceremony, rings and guests. But if no one had sex afterward, legally the marriage could be undone. So what did that mean in practice? Well, it meant that the most private moment of your life was in some cases witnessed, literally. Some castles and courts kept up the ancient tradition of the bedding ceremony, where witnesses, usually noble relatives or high-ranking staff, escorted the newlyweds to their chambers, tucked them in, and then either stood nearby or, no joke, peeked in to confirm evidence of consummation. The morning after, the sheets might be displayed to show signs of blood, believed to be proof of virginity. Whether that blood was real or staged, that's a whole other matter. Quirky historical tidbit. In 13th century France, there was a recorded annulment case, where a noblewoman claimed her husband had failed to consummate their marriage after 3 years. A panel of church officials required witnesses to testify about his inadequacies. The man, humiliated, insisted he could prove his potency. The solution? He was told to perform before a panel of clerics and physicians. In the end, he failed. The marriage was annulled, and she got to remarry, presumably with a more successful outcome. And it wasn't just noble women watching out for their reputations. Men could also bring claims, especially if a wife was suspected of being previously deflowered, or worse, already pregnant by someone else. In a few extreme cases, suspicious husbands requested virginity tests before a wedding. Midwives or older noblewomen would examine the bride-to-be, yes, that was a thing, checking for physical signs of intactness. Never mind that the human body doesn't work like a wine bottle with a tamper seal. The whole concept was flawed from the start, but the fear ran deep. The dowry system added another layer of complexity. A bride brought wealth, sometimes land, sometimes gold, sometimes livestock, into a marriage. If the marriage failed due to infidelity or infertility, the dowry might be withheld, seized, or even trigger a lawsuit. This meant that sex wasn't just a personal issue, it had economic consequences. Marrying off your daughter was like making an investment, and if she spoiled herself before the marriage could be finalised, that investment could crash. Now let's talk annulments. Divorce, in the modern sense, didn't really exist in medieval Christian Europe. Once married, you stayed married, unless you could prove something was fundamentally wrong with the union. That might include impotence, consanguinity, being too closely related, which happened a lot, fraud or lack of consummation. And proving those things? Complicated, humiliating, and public. Take, for example, the nobleman who tried to annul his marriage on the grounds that his wife was unnaturally cold. His argument? That her body temperature made physical intimacy impossible. The church, baffled but intrigued, ordered an inspection. No one found anything abnormal, and the annulment was denied. But the mere fact that this argument made it to a bishop's desk shows just how much sex, and the expectation of it, was baked into the legal fabric of marriage. There's still an ongoing scholarly debate about how common these annulments were. Some argue they were rare, and mostly limited to nobles who had the money and connections to navigate church bureaucracy. Others say annulment was used more often than we think, especially when a political alliance soured or a better match appeared. Either way, the message was clear. Sex made the marriage real. Without it, even a wedding with all the trimmings could be undone. Now imagine you're a 15-year-old noblewoman, recently wed, barely understanding what's expected of you, and now the entire estate is holding its breath to see if you bleed on the wedding sheets. Maybe you're terrified. Maybe you've already been with someone else. Maybe you fake it, with a little help from your handmaid and a pricked finger. You do what you have to do, because failure here doesn't just mean embarrassment. It means annulment, scandal, maybe exile. Or maybe you're the husband, nervous, inexperienced, and under pressure to perform, not just sexually but politically. You're being watched, whispered about. You know that if you fail tonight, your power could slip, your marriage could unravel, so you take a deep breath, or a strong drink, and hope that everything goes according to plan. But even when it did, things could still turn sour. A marriage might be legal, but not happy, and sometimes those unhappy marriages bred affairs, secret children, or worse, violence. If a noblewoman was caught cheating, her punishment could be exile, imprisonment, or death. A man, usually just a slap on the wrist, unless, of course, he embarrassed the wrong people. Marriage in the medieval castle was not a matter of romance. It was law, economics, and reputation management rolled into one. Sex was the glue, or the crack, that could hold it together or blow it apart, and everyone from the lord in the high tower to the clerk with the inkwell was watching. So while poets and troubadours were writing ballads about roses and sighs, the real work of love was happening in ledgers, in court records, and on the edge of the mattress, where failure wasn't just personal, it was legal. Tonight, you're leaving behind the velvet-draped chambers and dusty courtrooms to step into the rowdiest, least sanctified part of any medieval town or castle outpost, the red light district. Or, to put it in terms that medieval clerics might frown upon but definitely knew existed, the brothel. Because yes, prostitution was alive, well, and surprisingly institutionalized in medieval Europe, including within the orbit of castles. The nobility may have preached chastity and arranged marriages, but someone still had to keep the knights relaxed, the clergy tempted, and the economies of castle towns spinning. Now, before you picture dark alleyways and shameful glances, know this. Many medieval brothels weren't hidden at all. In fact, they were legally sanctioned, taxed, and regulated by towns that grew up around major castles. Cities like London, Paris, and Cologne had entire districts set aside for the trade, and some castles even had unofficial guest houses tucked behind their outer walls, less a secret than a mildly embarrassing feature, like a rogue uncle everyone pretends not to know is in the attic. Here's the strange part. The church officially condemned prostitution, of course, but practically many clerics tolerated it. The thinking went like this: better for men to relieve themselves with a sex worker than commit adultery or, heaven forbid, indulge in sodomy. It was considered a kind of necessary sin, one that could be managed if kept within designated boundaries. Some church leaders even argued that prostitutes kept the peace, because sexually frustrated men were more prone to violence. Charming logic, right? So who were these women working in and around castle communities? They weren't all the tragic figures you might expect. Many were poor, yes, orphans, widows, or unmarried women with no dowry. Some had been forced into the profession, particularly during times of famine or war, but others entered it with intention. For some, it was a choice between lifelong servitude in a noble household and relative independence, if precarious, in the brothel. And these establishments? Not all were dark, damp hellholes. Some were relatively clean, well-managed, and even stylishly furnished. A successful brothel might have feather mattresses, perfumes, clean linens, and musicians. The women dressed in brightly coloured clothing and often wore specific markers, red sashes, yellow veils, or bells, depending on the town's laws. This wasn't about subtlety, it was commerce, legal, visible, and humming quietly alongside the castle's more respectable functions. Of course, not everyone approved. Reformers railed against brothels, laws were passed, repealed, and passed again to limit where they could operate, what they could charge, and whether sex workers could enter churches or markets. But they persisted, because demand persisted. Nobles, knights, merchants, clergy, all of them showed up. Frequently. The guest books, if they'd kept them, would have been a nightmare of hypocrisy. Let's take a pause for your quirky historical tidbit. In Avignon, during the 14th century, brothels near the papal palace were known to be frequented by the clergy themselves. There's even a surviving record of one madam who sent a complaint to a bishop because a group of drunken monks refused to pay. She detailed the events with the flair of someone who'd dealt with this more than once. Shockingly, the bishop sided with her, a rare but telling crack in the moral glass. Now, not all prostitution was regulated. Castle festivals, jousts, and major feast days often drew in itinerant sex workers, some organised, others just hoping to make quick coin. Temporary brothels would pop up in tents or abandoned buildings. For a night fresh from a tournament, covered in bruises and starved for attention, these women were both comfort and celebration. It was chaotic, and it wasn't always safe for either party. And safety? That's where things got grim. Because while some brothels provided regular washing, herbal treatments and rudimentary care, many didn't. STIs spread rapidly, as we covered earlier, and when a woman became pregnant she had few options. Some brothels allowed her to keep working until late in the pregnancy, others forced her out. Some babies were quietly adopted by other workers, others weren't so lucky. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether prostitution empowered or exploited medieval women, and again, the answer is complicated. For some, it offered more freedom than domestic service, control over money, choice of clients, even the ability to live without a husband. For others, especially those trafficked or coerced, it was a prison. The experience varied wildly, depending on where you were, who ran the brothel, and how much protection or abuse came from local authorities. Men weren't entirely left out of this equation. While female sex workers were far more common, male prostitutes serving both women and men also existed, though in far smaller numbers. They operated more discreetly, often under the guise of servants or entertainers. Their presence is harder to document, partly due to shame, partly due to the extreme penalties for anything resembling sodomy. And what of the clients? The noblemen with too much mead and too little self-control. Some visited brothels openly, others sent servants to fetch someone clean and discreet. A few preferred long-term arrangements, essentially installing mistresses in townhouses or brothel chambers. In rare cases, a powerful man might try to rescue a prostitute, marry her, legitimize her children, give her a new life. These stories were romanticized later in literature, but most were far less glamorous, and many ended badly for the woman involved. Imagine now that you're one of these women, standing in the firelight at the edge of a castle town. You've powdered your face with flour, doused your hair in lavender water, and stitched your neckline just low enough to draw attention without inviting insult. The night is cold, but you've learned how to stand confidently, how to smile without promising, how to read a man's eyes before he speaks. Maybe you hope for a kind one tonight. Maybe just a quick one. Maybe you're saving up coin to buy your way out of here entirely. Or maybe you're the young squire, drunk on ale and peer pressure, being dragged toward the brothel by your older companions. You're not sure what you want. Not really. But inside, there's music and warmth and laughter that sounds almost real. You step through the door and for a few coins you're someone. Desired, touched, held. The castle might preach virtue, but outside its walls there's a whole system designed to handle what virtue can't. Prostitution in the Middle Ages wasn't a footnote. It was an institution. Complex, controversial, deeply human. And like everything else about sex in medieval castles, it reveals more about power, survival, and longing than any sermon ever could. Tonight, let's set aside all the nobles and the knights and the keep-bound dramatics, and shift the spotlight to someone else, the youth. Not the heirs or the princesses in waiting, but the real teenagers of the medieval world. Awkward, hormonal, constantly watched, and more or less terrified of doing something wrong. What did sex, or even the first blush of desire, look like for the young people growing up inside castle walls? Spoiler, it was a mess. A very controlled, tightly monitored, rumour-fueled mess, but still a mess. Let's start with the simple fact that, in a castle, you were almost never alone, especially if you were young, unmarried, and noble. Whether you were a lord's daughter or a page boy, someone was always watching. Parents, nurses, tutors, chaplains, guards, and nosy servants who lived for gossip. Privacy was a luxury you didn't get until your wedding night, and even then, as we've discussed, the audience might still be lurking outside your door. But privacy wasn't the only thing missing. Information was scarce, contradictory, and often flat out wrong. There was no sex ed class, no helpful pamphlet in your chamber, and definitely no candid conversation over breakfast. If you were lucky, an older servant might mutter a few warnings. More often, you just piece things together from dirty jokes in the stables and half-overheard adult conversations. The result? A whole generation of sexually repressed teenagers with zero context and maximum curiosity. For noble boys, the path to adulthood was structured around honour, obedience, and the total absence of vulnerability. You were trained to fight, to ride, to pray, and somewhere in that list, you were supposed to magically figure out how to be a man. Sex, of course, was part of that transition. Older knights might take a squire to a brothel as a rite of passage. It was less about pleasure and more about proving yourself, like a twisted midterm exam where you didn't get to study. Some of these boys developed crushes, on noble ladies, on serving girls, sometimes even on fellow squires. But courtly love rules didn't leave room for actual touching. You were supposed to write a poem, sigh dramatically, maybe tie her favour to your lance and pine for her while fighting in tournaments. If she actually touched you, that was scandal. If you touched her, that was disaster. So you wrote bad poetry, recited it to the moon, and hoped no one found your crumpled drafts. Girls had it even worse. A noble daughter's body wasn't her own. It was a family asset. Her virginity was more guarded than the castle gates. Chastity belts weren't real. Thankfully, more myth than metal, but the surveillance was. Governesses, chaperones, even older brothers all kept a sharp eye. If you lingered too long with a certain stable boy, someone noticed. If your gown was too low cut, someone scolded you. And if you actually liked someone, you buried it like contraband. But of course, feelings still happened. Hormones don't care about politics. That page boy who helps you into your saddle every morning, he smiles a little too long. That lady-in-waiting who braids your hair, she touches your shoulder with just a little extra care, and suddenly you're very aware of your heartbeat. But what do you do with that feeling? Nothing, usually. Just suffer. Unless, of course, you're brave enough, or reckless enough to act on it. Here's your quirky historical detail for tonight. Love tokens among teens were a huge deal. A lady might give a knight a sleeve or a ribbon, yes, but down in the castle halls, pages and maids swapped buttons, feathers, even fruit peels carved into heart shapes. It wasn't about grandeur, it was about subtlety. You wore her button on your tunic, that meant something. You tucked his hawk feather into your bodice, that was a choice. These were secret, sweet acts of rebellion in a world where desire was supposed to be silenced. Now, for those who did act on their feelings, well, things got complicated fast. If two teens were caught kissing in the gardens, punishments varied. Nobles might be separated, married off quickly, or, if it was really scandalous, sent away in shame. Servants and lower-class teens often fared worse. Girls could be dismissed or accused of seduction. Boys might be whipped or sent to the guardhouse. And if sex actually happened, if someone got pregnant, that was full-on crisis mode. In one case from 14th century Burgundy, a castle maid accused a young page of fathering her child. He denied it. She stuck to her claim, and eventually both were dismissed. No trial, no support, just gone. The baby? Quietly taken in by the kitchen staff. The gossip fed the castle's corridors for years. No one came out of it well, but it happened again, and again. Because youth doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. It moves, stumbles, reaches out, and hopes. There's a scholarly debate around how common adolescent sexual activity was in medieval castles. Some argue it was rare due to strict supervision and social pressure. Others point to evidence of pregnancies, private letters, and church confessions that suggest young people did find ways. After all, castles were sprawling, busy places with hidden corners and endless distractions. Where there's a will and a hayloft, there's usually a way. And let's not forget the emotional side of all this. Unrequited love wasn't just for troubadours. Teenagers in the Middle Ages felt all the same intensity. Heartbreak, longing, jealousy, obsession. A boy might sulk for weeks after a lady smiled at someone else. A girl might write secret prayers asking God to make him notice her. It wasn't all physical. It was that awful, aching kind of early love. The kind that leaves you staring at candles and reciting lines you heard once in a chapel. Imagine yourself now as a 16-year-old noble daughter, standing on a balcony, watching a tournament unfold. Your heart skips at the sight of a young knight, not the one your father wants to marry you to, but the one with the crooked grin who helped you fix your falcon's jesses. He rides past and you think he looks up. You tuck your handkerchief into your sleeve. Later that night you'll lie awake wondering if he saw it. Or maybe you're a page boy sharing a chamber with 4 other boys, but always watching just one. You don't know what you're feeling, not exactly, but when he gets hurt in training, your chest tightens in a way that has nothing to do with knighthood. You keep it to yourself. You write his name in the dust behind the chapel. You keep going. In castles where everything was choreographed, every meal, every prayer, every glance, the chaos of youth stood out like a fire in a snowstorm. It couldn't be contained. It could only be shaped, punished, or whispered about. And even then, it found a way. Because whether in courtly ballads or scribbled margins of a squire's notebook, the hearts of young people beat just as loudly then as they do now. And no curtain, no chaperone, no betrothal contract could ever truly keep them quiet. Tonight, we're headed to the loudest, most inappropriate and undeniably entertaining corner of the castle, the one where people tell dirty jokes, sing scandalous songs, and carve obscenities into the undersides of tables. Welcome to the unofficial soundtrack of medieval sex, the realm of jesters, minstrels, and the kind of humour that would definitely get you banned from Sunday service. Because while the church and nobility like to project an image of restraint, virtue, and candlelit purity, let's not pretend everyone was quietly reciting psalms. People laughed, loudly, and often about sex. You're in the Great Hall now, the feast long underway. The wine has flowed freely, trenchers are empty, and the lords and ladies are slouched, full-bellied and flushed. This is the moment when the jester appears, not with subtle wit, but with full-body gestures, exaggerated miming, and songs that rhyme sword with, well, words you wouldn't say in front of a bishop. His hat jingles, his tongue is sharp, and nothing is sacred. Not even the Queen. Maybe especially not the Queen. Medieval humour was bawdy by design. The idea wasn't just to amuse, it was to release pressure. Court life was stiff, rigid, and deeply hierarchical. A jester, or fool, had license to break the rules with laughter. And when it came to sex, the jokes weren't subtle. One popular routine involved pretending to bless a pair of chamber pots as newlyweds, then lifting the lid to show something wildly inappropriate inside. Another involved satirical songs about knights whose lances weren't quite battle-ready, if you catch my drift. But it wasn't just jesters. Minstrels and troubadours had their own ways of sneaking innuendo into their performances. Courtly love songs may have dripped with poetic longing, but plenty of them had double meanings that only became obvious on the second or third verse. One popular tune in Provence began as a tribute to a lady's roses, and ended with the singer begging to pluck them at night when her garden is quiet. The entire room knew what was going on, they just pretended to blush. Quirky historical tidbit for tonight. Marginalia. The weird little doodles you find in the margins of medieval manuscripts often included surprisingly graphic images. We're talking monks mooning each other, nuns riding fish, knights battling snails with suspiciously shaped helmets. One even shows a man playing the bagpipes with his, let's say, lower wind instrument. These weren't accidents. Scribes had long hours, access to ink, and just enough boredom to get creative. It's medieval graffiti, and a weirdly honest peek into what people found funny. Then there were the riddles. Oh yes, medieval folk loved riddles, especially the kind that walked the line between clever and obscene. Old English and Norse cultures were particularly fond of riddles that described something entirely innocent, until the punchline revealed you'd just been imagining something very uninnocent. For example, I am a wondrous thing, a joy to women, I grow very tall, when you touch me below, and into the hole I go. The answer, a key. But come on, you know what everyone was picturing. Of course, humour served more than just entertainment. It also worked as a kind of social commentary. Jokes about sex were a way to critique power, mock hypocrisy, and level the playing field, if only for a night. The local priest who preached chastity but was known to sneak visits to the town brothel. Fair game. The lord who married a young maiden and couldn't perform on their wedding night, definitely getting a song written about him. Humour was how people pushed back against the ridiculous expectations of court life. If they couldn't change the system, at least they could laugh at it. There's a scholarly debate about how widespread or accepted this humour was among the nobility. Some argue that bawdy entertainment was mostly for the lower classes, who needed an outlet. Others point out that nobles commissioned these performances, paid jesters and minstrels handsomely to deliver spicy satire, especially at weddings and feasts. The likely answer? Everyone laughed. They just pretended they didn't. And the church? It tried, valiantly, to shut it down. Moralists wrote long screeds against lewd music and unwholesome jesting. Certain bishops banned specific songs, claiming they inflamed the passions of the young and invited the devil into the dining hall. But you can't legislate laughter. The jokes just got sneakier, more clever, more layered, and sometimes even the bishops laughed. Quietly, behind a goblet of wine. Imagine you're a maidservant working at a wedding feast. You've been carrying trenchers all evening trying to avoid getting pawed by drunk squires. The jester starts a tune about a knight who couldn't find his sword on his wedding night. The hall erupts in laughter. You bite your cheek to keep from laughing, until your friend bumps your hip and sings the next line under her breath. You snort. Too loud. One of the knights hears, and just like that, you're part of the joke too. Or maybe you're a visiting lord, stiff with formality, seated next to a woman who won't make eye contact. The jester calls you out, mocks your fine boots, then your red cheeks, then your sword arm. Everyone laughs. You do too, grudgingly. But later, when that same woman slips a folded parchment into your hand and it contains the next line of the jester's song, rewritten with your name, well, maybe that wasn't humiliation. Maybe it was an invitation. Because humour, in these moments, didn't just entertain. It opened doors. A shared laugh could break tension, hint at interest, or even cover for desire. Flirting through jokes was safer than letters or glances, especially when your future depended on maintaining appearances, and in the end, the castle needed that relief. Between wars and debts and inheritance squabbles and spiritual guilt, people craved a moment to not take things seriously, to laugh at the absurdity of sex, love, marriage, and all the tangled politics that came with it. Whether it was in a jester's rhyming verse or a scribbled cartoon in a prayer book, the laughter was real. Because even in stone-cold castles, even under the gaze of saints and sovereigns, human nature peeked out from under the table and whispered something that made everyone spit wine. Tonight we slip into the shadows, not of candlelight, but of history itself. Because for every scandalous affair, every noble marriage, every steamy song and whispered insult, there's another layer to this story that often goes unnoticed. The silent witnesses, the forgotten voices, the lives between the lines. Tonight, we read the margins, literally and figuratively, because while medieval sex in castles left its mark in laws, rituals and records, much of it survives in the quieter places, letters, poetry, chronicles, and that strange, vulnerable space where fact and feeling collide. Start by imagining a chest. Not a big treasure box, not ornate or gilded, just a small wooden chest, tucked beneath a bed in a noblewoman's chamber. Inside are scraps of parchment, dried flowers, bits of ribbon, maybe a lock of hair. None of this is officially recorded. No one's scribbling it into the royal ledger. But these keepsakes, they are everything. They're the evidence of longing, of stolen moments, of relationships that had no business existing, but did anyway. Personal letters in the medieval period were incredibly precious. Paper was expensive, literacy was limited, and yet we find them. Letters from noblewomen to their lovers, apologies from wayward husbands, desperate pleas from discarded mistresses. One letter, from a 15th century French woman named Margaret, begs her lover not to forget her after being married off. "You have taken my heart," she writes. "It is not mine to give again." Her name appears nowhere else in the annals of history. But those 14 words? They've lasted 6 centuries. Sometimes love and lust hid in poetry. The troubadours of southern France perfected the art of saying a lot while appearing to say very little. "My lady has no mercy," one writes. "She slays me with her silence." Is it about unrequited love? Or about an affair that has grown dangerous? The ambiguity is the point. These poems were performed at court, often with the lover present in the room. A glance, a gesture, a pause on a particular syllable. That was the real message. Quirky historical tidbit for tonight. Medieval noblewomen sometimes wrote poems under male pseudonyms to avoid detection. One surviving Occitan poem by a so-called anonymous knight turns out, through handwriting analysis, to have been written by a woman known only as M. de Castelnau. The poem? A sexually charged lament about being forbidden from seeing her beloved. History almost lost her voice. Twice. Chronicles, those great dusty records of kings and wars, also betray little human slip-ups. A monk might record the birth of a child under uncertain stars, or the sudden marriage of a noble couple preceded by whispers. Sometimes a scribe would leave a curious gap in the record, as if deliberately omitting a name or incident. And then there are the miracles, like the tale of a woman who conceived despite her husband being at war. The chronicler just writes it down without comment, as if daring the reader to fill in the blanks. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how much these sources truly reflect reality. Are the poems just stylized fantasy? Were the letters forged or dictated? Can we trust the chroniclers, who were often monks with their own agendas? But the counter-argument is this. Even if some of it is exaggerated, it reflects something. People don't make up poems about affairs if affairs aren't happening. You don't write desperate love letters in a world where nobody feels anything. And then there are the confessions. Not the formal, sacramental kind, though those were written down too sometimes, but the quiet confessions embedded in journals and marginal notes. A knight scribbles a woman's name in the corner of his training manual. A bored clerk doodles a pair of legs under a nun's robe in the margin of a ledger. One nobleman, writing a private prayer, slips in a line about failing my vow of temperance for the 5th time this month. We don't know who with. We don't need to. The failure itself is the story. Castles, for all their rigidity, were full of cracks, places where feelings leaked out. In the middle of arranged marriages, religious expectations, and social surveillance, people still wanted what people always want: to be loved, to be seen, to touch, and be touched without fear. And when they couldn't live that out in public, they wrote, even if no one was supposed to read it, even if they themselves would never read it again. Imagine being a young noblewoman, slipping a folded bit of parchment into the sleeve of a passing knight. You don't sign it, you don't dare, but you've memorized every word, and when he glances back at you during supper, ever so slightly you think, he knows. Or maybe you're that knight, riding off in the early morning mist, the letter pressed to your chest. You can't read it now, but just having it feels like armour. Or maybe you're a servant girl who found someone's poetry under the laundry. You read it, then fold it again, pretending not to understand, but you do. More than they know. You tuck it away, not for gossip, for safekeeping. These aren't the loud, famous moments of medieval history. They're not the scandals that toppled kings or the marriages that sealed empires, but they matter. They're the real story, hidden between official records. Because sex in medieval castles wasn't just performance or politics, it was human. Messy, secret, often painful, but always real. So tonight, as you lie back and let your mind wander through time, imagine the castle not as a fortress, but as a living diary. One where the most honest entries weren't written in ledgers or carved in stone, but whispered behind curtains, inked on scraps, or sewn into the lining of a dress. History didn't always keep them, but every so often we find them, and when we do, we hear something extraordinary, a heartbeat. Tonight, as we take our final steps through the castle halls, soft-footed, candle in hand, the scent of old wood and wax in the air, we pause. Not because there's nothing left to see, but because this is the moment when we turn back and look at everything all at once. The lords in their embroidered tunics, the maids rushing with water jugs, the monks whispering through gritted teeth, the jesters who knew far more than they ever let on, the silences, the secrets, the soft groans through stone walls and the loud lies shouted across dining tables. This is the messy, breathing, frustratingly human reality of sex in medieval castles. Not a fantasy, not quite a tragedy, but never boring. We've travelled through bedrooms and brothels, confessionals and gardens. We've seen what desire looks like when it's bound by chains of politics, or caught up in the heavy robes of religion, or hiding in a corner behind a tapestry with one eye on the door. We've seen the power sex held, not just as pleasure, but as weapon, currency, curse, and hope. And we've seen what happens when people, even within the most rigid systems, try to make space for their wants anyway. Because let's face it, if medieval castles were designed to control behaviour, especially around sex, they did a spectacularly inconsistent job. The architecture tried: walls, gates, locked doors, watching eyes. The church tried: sermons, penance, fear of hellfire. The law tried: annulments, inspections, public shame. And yet, the people living inside those walls, They still flirted, cheated, hoped, and gave in. Because they were people, not characters from morality plays. They didn't wake up in the morning thinking, how best can I represent the ideals of feudal Europe today? No. They woke up wondering if he would look at them, or if she would write back, or if they could slip out tonight without being seen. The official story of medieval sex, the one you read in textbooks, is full of laws and liturgies. It wants to make everything seem neat and proper. But when you pull the curtains back, you find sheets that were definitely not clean, hearts that weren't supposed to want what they wanted, and hands that wandered a little too far under the dinner table. Even the people writing those laws were bending them, the ones giving the sermons, confessing later, the ones enforcing the rules, breaking them quietly, then pretending they hadn't. And let's not forget the quiet resistance. The sex worker who knew her way around the castle better than the guards. The young squire who fell in love with the wrong person and never told a soul. The noblewoman who brewed her own contraceptive tea in the dead of night, hiding it in a pewter goblet. The monks and nuns who wanted to be saints but couldn't always manage it. These weren't anomalies. They were normal. Their stories just didn't make it into the official record, at least not in their full, complicated truth. Quirky historical fact to end with. There's a 14th century record from a small castle in Bohemia that includes a strange entry. The lady of the house asked that her window shutters be reinforced. Too many boys are climbing them at night. No punishments were recorded. No one was named. Just the note sitting there, quietly acknowledging that even in stone towers there were ladders. Always. There's a scholarly debate that continues even now. Was medieval sexuality deeply repressed and carefully regulated, or was it more fluid and widely practiced than the church wanted to admit? Truth is, it was both. The system was repressive. The people were resourceful. They found their cracks in the wall, their codes, their loopholes, their moments in the stables, the kitchens, the cloisters. And maybe, after everything, the most surprising thing about medieval sex isn't how different it was from ours, but how familiar it is. The awkwardness, the longing, the secrecy, the heartbreak, the bad decisions made after too much wine, the midnight prayers not for salvation, but for someone to look your way, the ache of wanting what you're not supposed to want, and going for it anyway. So now picture yourself one last time inside that castle. Maybe you're standing on the battlements, wind tugging at your cloak, eyes scanning the dark fields below. You know what the world expects of you. The alliances, the bloodlines, the rules, but still somewhere deep inside you something sparks. A memory, a glance, a night that was yours and yours alone. And for a moment, that castle. It feels less like a fortress and more like a beating heart. Sex in medieval castles wasn't what we were told. It wasn't always about purity or debauchery. It was about survival, about rebellion, about being seen in a world that constantly tried to script every part of you. It was whispered, hidden, celebrated, punished, and occasionally glorious. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And honestly, isn't that the most human thing of all? You've met the girls who didn't have a choice, the boys who didn't have a clue, the queens who weaponized affection, and the monks who tried, and sometimes failed, to bury their desires beneath stone and scripture. You've watched as love tried to survive in a world ruled by bloodlines, duty, and God's ever-watchful gaze, and you've seen how it still bloomed, in secret gardens, in letters that never should have been written, in shared beds that cooled too quickly. Sex, as you now know, wasn't some side note in medieval life. It was everywhere. Policed, preached about, punished, paid for, praised, whispered, and feared. It wasn't just about pleasure. It was about control, power, and often survival. Bodies were currency, lust was politics, and love, that was the wild card. It didn't always fit into the ledgers and contracts and expectations, but it kept showing up anyway. Let's be clear, no one in these castles was living out a fantasy. There was no romantic filter over medieval desire, no ambient lute music playing softly in the background. It was messy, unfiltered, sometimes hilarious, sometimes tragic. People didn't have answers. They had instincts, curiosity, shame, need. And yet they navigated it all with the limited knowledge, the strict rules, and the fragile hopes they had. There's something oddly comforting in that, isn't there? To realise that even in an era when everything was supposedly preordained, your marriage, your position, your worth, there were still people breaking the rules. Still girls sneaking out past curfew, still boys carving initials into stable walls, still lovers finding each other in the most unexpected corners of a stone fortress built to keep everything out. Maybe that's the biggest surprise of all, that despite the walls, despite the weight of expectations, despite all the sermons and inked rules and scandalous consequences, desire endured. It adapted. It found cracks in the structure. It made its own spaces in the dark. So now, as you lay back, maybe with the lights dimmed and that soft background hum of a fan going, take a deep breath. You made it through the myths. You saw behind the curtain, and maybe, just maybe, you understand the past a little more clearly now. Not because it's so different from today, but because, deep down, it really isn't. People are people, then and now. And whether in a cold castle chamber or a modern apartment lit by phone screens, we still ache for closeness. Still reach for each other in the dark. Still break the rules, and write our names where no one is supposed to see them. Sleep well, time traveller.